3, 2, 1, and we are rocking and rolling. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Today's conversation is going to be a juicy one. I'm very happy to be joined today by Chris Ferguson. Chris is a professor of psychology at Stetson University in Florida and the author of several books, including most recently, How Madness Shaped History, an eccentric array of maniacal rulers, raving narcissists, and psychotic visionaries, which, as the title suggests, is a pretty comprehensive look at how madness has affected world leaders, people of influence, and really entire societies throughout history. It's a topic I'm really fascinated by, so I'm buzzing to get into it. Chris Ferguson, thank you for joining me, and welcome to the Seb Whitehouse Show.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me today. It's pretty awesome to be on. I appreciate it.
Oh, mate, it's my pleasure. I'm always blown away every time I sit down to have one of these conversations about the fact that we're able to have this conversation with me sitting in the southwest of England and you sitting over there in Florida. It's just, I think it's always important to just remember kind of how mind-blowing that is in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's absolutely nuts.
Technology is wonderful, you know.
It is. It's an amazing thing. So yeah, I mean, mate, let's cut straight to the chase. There's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, especially the last few years, and I really want to run it past you. So basically, I'm fascinated by the extent to which environmental conditions can affect human behavior. It's like a really sobering thought when you think of the sort of mass murder and cruelty that took place on an industrial scale in places like obviously Nazi Germany, Maoist China, Soviet Union, Rwanda, to name but a few. Which obviously kind of contributes to the idea that in an environment dominated by fear and propaganda, normal human beings are capable of horrific evil. But you put forward like a slightly different argument in the book, which I found interesting. What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the environmental stuff does matter. I mean, you know, I think that obviously, particularly when you end up with situations where resources are scarce, then competition for those resources is kind of naturally going to increase. But I think what had happened is in a lot of books that kind of talked about like the environmental impact on history. It's not that those books were wrong. I think they actually made a lot of really strong points about that, but they oftentimes would de-emphasize what sometimes is called like the great person hypothesis. So there's also this sort of competing idea that was really popular 19th century, early 20th century, that like individuals matter. You have like in the United States, of course, like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, you know, in England, you might say like Elizabeth I or Winston Churchill, that these individual personalities kind of matter and can reshape the direction of history. So if it wasn't for Elizabeth I, maybe we'd all be talking Spanish, or without Churchill, German, you know, as the case may be, you know. So, but that kind of fell out of favor really in history, among academics in history in the latter half of the 20th century, and in favor of more of these sort of structural explanations of like things like the environment or plagues or access to resources. Like if you lived in the Americas, you didn't have horses, you know, and that kind of mattered. And I think that I buy that. I think that all is important, but I think that people sort of lost track of where individuals do matter. And I think, in fact, you know, individual personalities really can step into history. I think we're seeing this right now with Putin in Russia, for instance. You know, individual personalities really can step in and change the direction of history, sometimes for the better, you know, and most of the names I mentioned, I think we would think of as being pretty good individuals for stepping into history. But I have a very morbid sense of, you know, of things that I appreciate. So I really wanted to talk about the other side and individuals that have stepped into history and made things worse. Those are the people that I find a little bit more interesting. So I provide a bunch of different examples that's in small ways and in large ways, individuals that really did matter in terms of shaping the direction of our history, usually for the worse.
Yeah, and something that I found really interesting was that you mentioned that you don't necessarily think that, I mean, I don't want to take the words out of your mouth, so perhaps you can clarify this. But you said something along the lines of, in places such as Nazi Germany and Maoist China, it's not that there were loads of human beings with a unique capacity to evil. It's that it's that the conditions presented themselves that people that were mad or mentally ill were able to step up into positions of authority when in a normal functioning society, they may not have been able to. And I found that really interesting, because when I look at those periods of history, I've always assumed that they're proof that human beings have a unique capacity for evil in particular environments. And I'm sure you agree there's got to be some truth to that, but I'd never really thought about particular environments giving space for people with mental illnesses to step forward into those positions.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Twitter, right? In a way, basically. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, I mean, I agree with you. We do, as a species, have really broad capacity for bad behavior. So I don't think there's any question about that. And in fact, I think that probably has evolved in some ways to be, advantageous, at least in our sort of evolutionary past. You can kind of look at chimpanzees, and chimpanzees are, abhorrent creatures. Really, they're mean spirited. They kill each other. I don't know why anybody keeps them as pets. This really is an amazing thing. If you knew anything about them, they make terrible terrible house pets for good reason, because they're very strong and they're very aggressive. And they engage in what looks like genocidal war with each other. They're tribes, so it's only a few dozen individuals, but so it's not a surprise that, we act very similar to our closest genetic relative in terms of this horrible behavior that we can engage in. But you do see these like incentive structures kind of change. I mean, one thing that's happened in the West over the last 150 years has been the evolution of modern police forces, and I know, of course, that's been controversial over the last 2 years. But generally speaking, part of the reason why you and I can walk down the street and probably not get killed is because of modern policing, so that changed the incentive structure. So if you believe that you can kill someone or rape someone or steal from someone without consequence, that increases the rate of that behavior than if you believe that there's going to be some sort of societal deterrence for that. Now, what happens in places like Nazi Germany is that incentive structure changes, so the individuals who are given influence ends up changing. So you can take a person like Irma Gries, who I talk about in the book. She was the hyena of Auschwitz, and you kind of look at her in terms of the documentation we have on her in this point in time. You think of like, what would she have been like if she had been born in Orlando in 1985? And the result is that we probably never would have heard of her. She would be a horrible human being, but she probably would not have risen very far in our society for exactly that reason. If you flip things around and you start to incentivize or give power to the people who are the most extreme, then you end up with a very different structure, where she was able to rise through the ranks, become a prison guard, engage in a lot of brutality for which she was not punished. And that's kind of what happened in the Nazi regime, is you took a bunch of, they weren't crazy in the sense of having schizophrenia or chronic mental illnesses, but their personalities were so distorted. They were very rigid, paranoid, cruel personalities, and you gave them influence. And what you end up with is a pretty terrible regime. And the average person mostly wants to keep their head down and not get in trouble. They don't want to get brutalized or for that matter, lose their job. So oftentimes the average person will just kind of go along with the structure of power. So I kind of made the joke about Twitter, but Twitter's actually, it's only half a joke. I mean, it's very similar incentive structure where the loudest, most extreme voices get amplified, and then you have a situation like Netflix with Dave Chappelle, that there's this outcry over Dave Chappelle. I don't know if that became a story in the United Kingdom or not, but
yes,
over here it was. He made some comments that I understand people were offended by, but there was this big outcry. You need to censor him, take him down off of Netflix. And it turned out it was a really tiny minority of people that were on board with that. 99% of people liked his, if you look at the user reviews, I think maybe it was like 95%, something like that, but really, really high positive rating. But, it seemed like Netflix was scared of this relatively small minority of individuals who don't represent the average trans individual. They don't represent the average non-binary individual. They're just the loudest, most extreme, probably borderline personality disordered individuals, and we're giving them outsized influence in our society. And that's kind of a we're not like Nazi Germany, but nonetheless, it's not the healthiest thing that we're experiencing. So yeah, sometimes you can see the situation where societies set up structures that allow more extreme voices to take control, and usually the result is disaster, as we're kind of seeing.
Yeah, and I find that a really interesting perspective because there's no doubt a lot of truth to it, and I don't see that it's necessarily a competing hypothesis with the idea that humans in certain situations may have a capacity for evil, even if they're not mental or insane or whatever word you want to use. I suppose both things can be true. You can have a certain set of environmental conditions where an otherwise good person is incentivized to take part in horrific acts, and at the same time an environmental situation where more mentally unstable people are likely to emerge. But do you feel that generally the latter is more prevalent in those situations, or do you think that you gave the example of is her name Irma Geese? Did you say
Irma Grease, I believe it was.
Irma Geese? Yeah, I did read in the book, but
I'm terrible with spelling, but I think that's how it was spelled. Yeah.
So with her, you gave the example that you think that if she was living in Florida now, she'd be a terrible human being there as well. So to what percentage of people, I obviously can't give an exact percentage, but I suppose to what extent do you think there are people in those societies who actually, if they were living in our society now, would be good people? Yeah. But do you know what I mean? Do you think your hypothesis is more prevalent than the one that I've thought about, basically?
Yeah. Well, I think it's probably easier to give sort of prevalent or, best guess prevalence figures for sort of the opposite, what percentage of people probably are like truly horrible. And because we have diagnoses for those, so we have like, there are two. So there's antisocial personality disorder, which is about 4% of males and about 1% of females. And then there's borderline personality disorder, which is kind of the inverse, about 3% of females, about 1% of males. They're very similar. They're both very aggressive. Just the borderline version is a little bit more out of control, more impulsive. The antisocial is more of your typical psychopath and that sort of stuff. So we're really talking about a relatively small percentage of the population that are just kind of, at the core, have these kinds of unsympathetic, maybe to say that they're cruel is taking it a little bit too far, but certainly like non-empathic, sort of personalities that are not too worried about the harm they cause to other individuals. The vast majority of people are kind of in the middle where, we sort of try to do the right thing, but it's easy to convince us that the right thing is to be brutal to the other side of whatever conflict you're engaged in. So there's some empathy, but our empathy is somewhat selective, so we tend to be more most empathic towards our families, and then it kind of like broadens out from there. We're a little bit less empathic towards our friends, but still pretty empathic. We're pretty empathic towards people in our group, so that it used to be like Americans or Brits or Germans or whatever. Now it's increasingly left versus right. And then whoever's in the out group, we tend to be least, empathic towards. So that's where you get things like racism, sexism, all the phobias and all that kind of stuff. But also these kinds of like political polarization where you can see just like otherwise smart people online, like laughing when a conservative dies from COVID or something of that sort, which is an incredibly cruel and immature response. And this might be someone with a PhD, that really ought to know better. And they're not a psychopath. This is just part of the unflattering side of humanity, which is probably quite diffuse, and you can see when groups come into conflict, the average person will kind of go along with their group and, are perfectly happy to sort of demonize or dehumanize, people on the other side. So in terms of like the percentage of people who you said are truly, truly good, we're sort of able to rise above that, for instance. I say, we don't have a diagnosis for that. So we don't have real prevalence figures for it. But I would say it's probably, in terms of thinking like in terms of bell curves, a lot of things in human behavior form on a bell curve. And if we're saying about 3 to 4% of the population, male and female, is truly bad, then you're probably talking about 3 to 4% really being able to kind of rise above those group dynamics and sort of truly embrace universal principles of human rights and things like that. Most of us are inherently tribal, unfortunately.
Do you think those 3 or 4% of good people who are able to like universally embrace human rights, do you think that they're the people that may have been more likely in Nazi Germany, for example, to be hiding Jews underneath the floorboards and helping them escape?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are the people that will act against their own self-interest in ways that put themselves in danger, where, again, most of us, wouldn't do that. Most of us might think it's probably a bad idea to kill all of our Jewish neighbors, but I don't want to get killed. So, that I feel really bad, but I'm not going to do anything, and I think that was kind of a more typical response. But yeah, sort of the individuals who really sort of stuck their neck out, and made some effort. And I think we're seeing this a little bit, with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, that there are some people in Russia who protested, and this sort of stuff. So they're obviously putting themselves in some jeopardy, in that regime. So it does happen, but it's hard to get the average person to do that. And what you kind of need to have happen, if you're looking for this kind of like structural change and you want these sort of like positive leaders to really hold sway, is it's almost like a few brave souls need to step through the barrier in the wall, the break in the wall, essentially, and survive, and once the rest of the people can see that these sort of leaders actually survive, then you'll get the sort of outcrying of public support in favor of perhaps a more pro-social, or more universalist approach to something like that. But you do unfortunately need a few people to sort of step up and take those chances, and then hopefully survive. But of course, what happens is whatever the power is in place, the regime tries to make sure they don't survive, imprison them, kill them, shame them, whatever it may be, so that is a deterrence for everybody else.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Twitter and the culture wars, and I think there's definitely truth in regards to what you're saying with Twitter and the culture wars, because I would say a few years ago, the type of people that were willing to speak up and say that they didn't necessarily agree with the far leftist narrative on whether it be race or gender or sexuality, there were not many people just a few years ago that were able to just to speak out and say exactly what they thought. But a few people continue to do it, and now many, many, many more feel able to do that. So in our, like I say, you gave the example of Twitter. I'd say that what you just said is a microcosm of actually what's happened in our society at the moment as well.
Yeah, it absolutely was the case. And I remember it, it was very acute, of an experience for me in the United States, in the summer of 2020, and I'll say up front, I don't support the Black Lives Matter organization. They're in fact now being investigated, but certainly accused of financial irregularities and this kind of stuff. So their credibility has sort of gone down anyway.
They bought a mansion in
LA.
Bought
a lot of mansions, actually, it turned out, between the individuals and the organization itself. So it looks like it might have been a bit more of a grift than a legitimate. Of course, if you say like, do Black Lives Matter? Of course they do. It's absurd to say that, that the slogan doesn't have some truth to it, of course, but obviously in terms of the organization, but there was that sense of like, to step up and say, hey, the actual data on race and policing is way more complicated and nuanced than what people are saying on the streets. Was scary, because there is this sense that someone's going to come for my job. I got to support a wife and a kid, and that's really unnerving. I watched a colleague get fired, for more or less, speaking out about some of this stuff. And so that was certainly unnerving at the time. So you definitely could, and that was really weird for me, in the sense of I've never experienced that at least being on the left. I'm an Obama progressive myself, but being on the left, it really was the sense of in academia, that academia was about truth, it was about debate, it was about open inquiry, that you could challenge the status quo. And of course, if you had tenure, you shouldn't lose your job for doing that. And I watched a tenured colleague lose his job, for doing exactly this. So that was a really, really weird moment to sort of watch this kind of groupthink, the sort of social shaming being used to coerce people into, saying or doing things that maybe they didn't believe was true. And of course, that's still true today. It's not as bad as it was 2 years ago. As you can see, I feel a lot freer saying things that I would have probably hesitated to say 2 years ago. But did think, at that time, and it is powerful. And you kind of think of like, oh yeah, if I lived in Nazi Germany, I would absolutely be, I would not, there's this picture of I saw on the internet, and assuming it's an accurate picture, it's always something that's dangerous on the internet, but assuming it's an accurate picture, it's this picture of all these people at this Nazi rally, and they have their hands out and sort of Nazi salute. And there's this one dude who's got his like arms folded, he's just not doing it. And everybody thinks they're going to be that dude, right? And we all think we're going to be that person because it seems so obvious in retrospect. It's Monday morning quarterbacking. But when you go through it, on any level, and of course, what happened in the United States in 2020 was not the same, not nearly as bad as what happened in Nazi Germany. But
that makes you worry even more that you're not going to be that dude, because I was scared a couple of years ago, saying what I thought as well. I did a little bit, and I did lose some friends, but I didn't exactly shout it from the rooftops. Although I did make one Facebook status which got a lot of negative attention. But that's the worry, isn't it? We all want to be that dude in Nazi Germany, but what's happened over the last couple of years makes me think, oh God, I'm kind of close but no cigar.
Yeah. It's like a balancing act, right? I mean, I kind of think of it as being strategic in some sense of like figuring out do you want to be the guy in Tiananmen Square who stood in front of the tank, kind of thing. Yeah, he's a great guy. We all admire him, but I think he's probably dead. So how do you kind of accomplish that without, so there is that sort of sense of like, I do need to resist this, but how do I do it without flaming out?
It's like a risk to reward thing, isn't it?
Yes,
it's like in Nazi Germany, when there's millions of people's lives on the line, you might think that the principle inspires you more to stand up to it. Whereas when it's a social media shitstorm, you might make the educated decision of just like, oh, this isn't quite worth putting my neck on the line for.
And of course there's also a difference between, I think, there also is a sense of stepping back and sort of choosing your moment, sort of thing, like I said, being a bit strategic, as opposed to, I think a lot of people just unquestionably just went with the crowd and, put the little black square on their Instagram and, and put the Black Lives Matter fist in their Twitter bio or whatever else, and that was just sort of a social contagion as much as anything else. And so and I think that aspect I sort of understood, that if you are strategic, maybe stepping in front of the train while it's at full velocity is not the wisest thing, but give it a month or two and then find ways to start challenging status quo, as opposed to simply like 2 years ago we didn't even talk about systemic racism, and all of a sudden that's all we're talking about, and like you just suddenly decide this is true. I don't know that I believe you that you really thought about this, as opposed to are just doing it because your friends are doing it, and all the people around you, mostly in elite, academic-y kinds of spaces are so it seems like it's almost so I can't remember the gentleman's name, but I just heard a podcast yesterday which was talking about luxury beliefs, so like defund the police is a luxury belief that elite people think it's people that can hire their own security, think that this is a good idea, that nobody in the working class thinks this is a good, not working class Black Americans, not working class Latino Americans, nobody thinks this is a good idea, other than people at Harvard.
Well, ironically, like having that belief maybe a sign of privilege. I was thinking about this earlier, like a surefire way of knowing that you probably don't live in an oppressive country is if you have the freedom to relentlessly call it an oppressive country all day long. If you can call your country oppressive without any comeuppance or consequence, then you probably don't live in an oppressive country. And the defund of the police crowd, I think, are coming from that same sort of like sentiment,
they don't. I think you're right. I mean, a lot of these arguments aren't really entirely thought through. I mean, I think you could say like maybe obviously the U.S. has a history of racism and slavery and Jim Crow and all that stuff, and there may be lingering impacts from all that. I mean, I don't think that's a terribly controversial thing to say, but I agree with you. The sense of like where you have individuals say, the United States is a white supremacist country, and it's in like the New York Times or something of that sort. Like, I don't know that like in apartheid South Africa that would have made a headline in a national paper. Sort of, what I mean. So sometimes you have to think like, all this talk about like power and privilege and this kind of stuff, and people talk about, certain groups are more privileged than others, but they're talking about it in the New York Times, which is a really privileged outlet. to end up publishing in, so I mean, I think things are more complicated and nuanced than it oftentimes is presented. There's a lot of evidence against a lot of these beliefs, whether it's systemic racism, the idea that police are engaged in a genocide of Black Americans, or that the U.S. is a white supremacist, or the United Kingdom is a white supremacist country, and so on and so forth. But, once people kind of get attached to some sort of moral or emotional agenda, it's really harder to convince them that things are more complicated. We don't have to say that the U.S. is a racial utopia either. There's a wide range between we're living in that Star Trek universe where color doesn't matter at all versus, this is 1955 Jim Crow. I mean, there's a wide range of possibilities between that, right? And we don't have to say these are two choices. But that sometimes seems how people seem to perceive it. It's sort of like we've made no progress at all since, the 1962, 1963, when civil rights started to kind of kick in. Or, if you suggest there's been any progress, that somehow makes you unconcerned or racist, or, you're not concerned about lingering disparities or whatever else. So, it's really kind of forcing people in this sort of binary moral system, Manichaean kind of moral system. And then once you do that, once people sort of establish I'm a good person because I have a Black Lives Matter fist on my Twitter bio, then trying to point to them well, if you actually look at the number of unarmed Black men who were killed in the U.S. in 2021, it was 4. And the number of unarmed white Americans was almost twice. It was a lot larger number. And maybe things are a bit more complicated than we're necessarily, and it's hard to sometimes break through that because you can see people, and it's mostly, I think, again, relatively privileged, often white, highly educated people who really have established their moral center around some of this stuff, and it's really impervious to data, which is a little bit sad to see sometimes.
Yeah, well, I've just had Douglas Murray's book arrive in the post, The War on the West, and I was reading it last night, and he goes over this in some detail. I've, like yourself, been aware of it for the last couple of years, but I think that was a survey, and around 20 or 30% of Americans that refer to themselves as a very liberal guessed that there was anywhere between 2,000 and 10,000 unarmed Black men killed by the police each year. So, I mean, this is just a completely and utterly false narrative, which hundreds of millions of people around the world have bought into. And it's kind of dystopian, it's kind of unsettling. And the worst thing is when you try and explain it to people, they get offended and triggered. But in actuality, if they would actually listen, they could receive it as good news. Right. That's the thing that gets me. This is good news, guys. They want to believe that thousands of unarmed Black men are being killed, rather than they want to believe the truth that is not happening. And that's what I find very strange about it as well. And I think that's where we get into sort of tribalistic states of mind, because it's not polarization. These aren't polite disagreements between two sort of different camps who are entrenched in their ideas but are listening to other people's ideas in good faith. This is kind of tribalism, which is the people that you disagree with have no redeeming features, and it's a zero-sum game, and there is a cost to even giving them an inch.
Giving people good news, I find, is surprisingly difficult. I mean, I agree with you. I've experienced this, and this isn't the first area I've experienced this. I mean, if you I agree with you though. If you say things, well, we're not perfect, but obviously things are better than 1955, and any whether it's the U.S., UK, in most places in the West, at the very least. And even internationally, if you kind of tell people look, on almost any metric, the average person in the world is much better off than they were 30, 40 years ago, where it's poverty, health, violence, so on and so forth. People get mad. I don't get it. People get, but I've had, so I did a lot of research on video games. That's probably where I started heading into some of these, it's weird to think of video games as being controversial, but they were at the time. And, back 20 years ago in the United States, I don't think it was as bad in the United Kingdom, but in the United States, certainly people thought that video games cause mass homicides and, and situations like that. And then you kind of come up and you present research saying actually, you know what? Yeah, most of your boys, at least in certain, and a lot of your girls, but most of your boys are playing violent video games. But hey, the good news is, and you can't stop them. I have a teenage son myself. You can't really have that much control over their behavior. But the good news is that it doesn't matter. Like it has no impact on their aggression. They're not going to become a mass homicide perpetrator. Their mental health is going to be fine. It has really no effect. And people get angry. Like, parents will say, but, I don't know, but I got into a fight with my kid over playing video games or something like that. So I can see that it makes them aggressive. Well, it might be you, that maybe it's the way you approach this, Well, a lot of what happens with parents, I don't mean to, deviate off into video games for too long, but, I think a lot of what happens with parents is they kind of slam down on their kids when they see their kids playing video games. And a common one is they'll try to tell their kid to stop playing video games like right now. And unfortunately, the kid's in the middle of a social game. They're playing with friends online and they need like 10 or 15 minutes to finish up whatever they're doing. And that's where a lot of fights start. The parent thinks you can just turn it off on a dime. And the kid's like, I'm going to be rude to my friends if you make me do this. And then an argument starts. And the parent attributes that to the game as opposed to their own unawareness of how games work. And if you just give the kid a 15-minute heads up, then you probably would have avoided the fight, and that's in most situations, but yeah, people are I don't know what it is. I mean, it fascinates me that, sort of giving people like, you tell like environmentally conscious people that, global warming is a real issue, but it's probably not true that we're all going to be dead in 12 years. That worst case scenario will probably just adjust somehow, then they freak out. Or if you say like, hey, nuclear energy isn't that bad, it turns out, that people will just get angry. This is good news. You can stop burning coal if you use nuclear. This is good news, right? And they're, no, nuclear is bad. Nuclear is bad. It just points to like the irrationality, which again, I think is a very human, most of us don't think rationally. We think emotionally, and that's a very human thing. And it's very difficult to nudge people past that. And it takes patience and time, and it does work over time, if you keep presenting the data over and over, but most people don't have that patience, so they're like, I'm going to argue with my friend on Facebook. And if they don't agree with me, then I'm going to call them a Nazi and I'm just going to give up, having anything to do with conservatives or liberals or whatever the other side happens to be. And the reality is that when you're in a conflict with someone and you're trying to exchange views, it's better to stay civil and be patient. And you're not going to see that person change their mind in front of you. That's saving face. Nobody in the middle of a heated debate changes their mind in the middle of the debate. But you may have impact on them that you're not aware of. You may never get that feedback. And that's still worth doing. It's actually more worth doing than saying, well, piss off, you Nazi fuck or whatever, if you didn't buy part. I don't know if that language is allowable on your podcast. I don't know if this is like a family show or I mean, so people just get frustrated quickly, and frustration breeds aggression, and there you go. And just becomes just a circle effect, and everybody gets frustrated and just gets worse and worse, and it's hard to break people out of it.
So on the topic of humans thinking emotionally rather than rationally, do you think human morality is inherently tribalistic, and that's why we think emotionally, because our tribal tendencies and our moral mind are so intricately linked? Yeah,
that's a good question. So there seem to be and there are these psychologists who study morality in much more detail than I do. So I'm not an expert in sort of the development of morality, although I have some knowledge of how that works. But there seems to be a few things that are kind of moral universals. So if you kind of look at the morality across cultures, that you'll find a fair degree of consistency. So things like murder tends to be taboo, in most cultures. Incest tends to be taboo in most cultures. I mean, you can find exceptions, obviously, but but for the most part, these are like
the Habsburg jaw being one exception, which I learned about in your book.
Or the pharaohs of Egypt, of course, and there are a few other places. They actually there's a obviously they had a rationale for why. It was all about the pure royal blood or divine blood or whatever, but it turns out genetically it's a really bad idea, as we all know, to go down that path. But rape for the most part is taboo, although obviously different cultures define it differently, and sometimes the reason why it's taboo has less to do with women's trauma and more to do with sort of property and family and honor and that kind of stuff. So, but you do kind of find some of these things seem to be, fairly universal, which suggests there may be some sort of adaptive nature to some degree of morality. And of course, like the whole idea of shared morality also is adaptive in the sense of like group cohesion, right? So humans are really poor at surviving on their own, but surviving in groups were pretty good. And having sort of a moral cultural structure seems to help with that, which is probably why all cultures have some degree of morality. But then, of course, you can see other things that differ widely. So, if you are smoking pot, right, in the United States, it's no longer a big deal. But if you were doing it 50 years ago, it was, and if you view porn, in Germany, I don't think anybody cares, right? In the United States, it's kind of naughty, but you won't get arrested. And in other countries, you might get arrested. Yeah, like Saudi Arabia, something like that, right? So you also can see these kind of differences in morality that exist, between cultures. And again, I think sometimes, codes of morality exist for different reasons. Sometimes they're obviously to control people's behavior, to sort of direct them in the way that is, at least in theory, good for the culture. It doesn't always work out that way, of course, but that is the idea. So you'll see things like taboos against contraception that are particularly prevalent when population rates are relatively low and child mortality rates are high. Once you get into big industrial Western societies where child mortality is low and conception rates are pretty high, then people start to use contraception all over the place. And then you end up with actually the opposite problem where you have fewer and fewer people, you have an aging populace and stuff. So sometimes morality can change depending upon the exact environmental circumstances in which we are living. And then, of course, also morality is sometimes used by powerful people to maintain power. You're right. So elites, again, some people don't like it when I use the word elites, but whatever we talk, the managerial class, whatever we want to refer to this particular group of people, will sometimes develop codes of morality that will maintain their own sort of structures of power and divide other individuals who may not be part of it, keep them out of the power structure. So there is this argument, for instance, right now, that a lot of the sort of new left morality around race, for instance, is probably not intentional on most people's part, but there may be an element of it that is specifically designed to keep the working class, Black, Latino, white Americans divided, so they don't all realize they're getting screwed by the upper classes, who are becoming more and more wealthy over time. And I think there's some argument, for that. So, I mean, obviously morality is complicated. Some of it probably, the idea of developing moral structures probably is an evolved capacity, but obviously specifically how we structure that moral code can depend upon specific social circumstances that each culture is experiencing.
Do you think that the kind of the interweaving sort of link between morality and tribalism is part of the reason that our discourse is so toxic at the moment? Because it's all of these issues that people are disagreeing, it seems to be fundamentally moral issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So once people develop something that's kind of like a moral truth, it's very difficult to persuade them to change that. It's not impossible, but it's very, very difficult to change them to persuade them to change that sort of moral, because it becomes part of their identity, right? It's almost like this is divine words from God, and even if they're not religious, a lot of these kind of moral structures take on a quasi-religious sort of component to it, where you are a heretic if you, which is all about the cancel culture, right? You're a heretic if you dare to try to challenge these types of structures. If your belief is purely scientific, and someone presents data that challenges that, then who cares, right? It's not personal, right? So we should change our views of things. And sometimes that is the case. I'm trying to think of, example, like, this is a really stupid example, but, the last couple of years, I always had this idea that only queen ants can reproduce, right? Most people kind of think only the queens can reproduce. I learned just in the last few years that there are some types of ants, where the worker ants, who are also female, can also reproduce, So, okay, I had a scientific belief, somebody presented evidence, and now I had to kind of change, some element, nobody cares about ants though, right? Unless you're like a real big ant fan or something like that, right? So it's very easy in that situation to change my beliefs based on new data, because my core identity isn't based upon whether queen ants or worker ants reproduce, right? On the other hand, if I think that, it's, literal murder if you don't allow a 13-year-old to get hormones or surgery to change their identity, that they are going to kill themselves if you don't immediately affirm their presented identity when they're a relatively young teenager. Then if somebody comes along and says, hey, the evidence suggests that some of these individuals really are trans and some of them have borderline personality disorder. And maybe we should stop for a little bit and do a psychological evaluation and try to distinguish between these two groups, because some might benefit. I think this is fairly non-controversial. What I'm kind of saying, we ought to stop for like 30 days and do a psychological evaluation. That's all I'm saying, right? It's not that nobody should go on hormone treatment, when they're teenagers. Maybe some should, maybe they really would benefit from it, right? But we should take some time to distinguish between these two groups. There are certain people, I'm not taking the conservative stance, which is this is all rubbish, and that, if you're born a boy, you're always a boy. If you're born a girl, you're always a girl. And, but just saying we should stop and, evaluate this before we have people get top surgery or something like that. There's a certain segment that's heresy, right? You're anti-trans if you're a transphobe if you say something like that. Even if you say some kids would benefit, from this sort of thing, right? And the discourse around some of those issues, and I think the trans issue is like the worst one. I think it's worse than race, right now, at least in the United States. Seems like some European countries are kind of backed up. I think the UK, Sweden, a few other places are kind of backed away from some of that, but we're still right in the center of the sort of affirmation approach to gender identity. There certainly are people that are going to watch this interview, just like J.K. Rowling, right? Not Rowling. Yeah, I don't know. And I've read her stuff, and and I don't agree with everything she says, but it's interesting that there's no difference in people's minds between like the hardcore conservative who thinks that trans people should go to hell and someone who argues that, hey, maybe we should stop for 30 days and give a psychological eval to make sure we've identified properly who would benefit from these treatments. That's amazing that there's like no distinction, in some people's minds between those two arguments, and of course conservatives do the same thing, right? So you see this, like, I don't know if it's come across to the UK. We have this whole like groomer thing that's occurring in the United States now, where there's like, obviously some American schools have made catastrophically bad decisions about books that they've allowed it to, it's probably pretty rare, but it has happened. And we on the left should acknowledge that. Like, some of the stuff that some of the schools are doing is probably pretty bad, but it's not like pedophilia is running rampant in the schools either, so this is kind of absurd to say that like everybody who allows a kid to read, Tango Makes Three. I think that's the book with the penguins. Two male penguins adopt a baby penguin. Is like a pedophile. No, I mean, come on. So there again, there are gradations of like, there's always that slogan, right? You shouldn't assume malevolence when incompetence would explain the behavior equally well. And we should have a certain degree of generosity that, people may come to different views that we disagree with, that in most cases are good faith. And they might be horribly wrong, but they are good faith, efforts to try to make things better. So I think even with on the left, where we have some teachers who have allowed some books to enter or just trainings about gender identity, whatever, that are not science-based, that maybe are too explicit in some situations. And I think that has happened a few times, that most of them are probably still acting in the game. Maybe a few really are groomers. I don't know, but I don't think the average teacher is necessarily, intending to do harm, to kids. And I think that kind of dialogue makes it more difficult. First off, you lose. It sounds absurd, so the average person in the center, like me, I think I'm pretty much in the center. I actually have some sympathy with some of the conservative complaints about schools, but just talking about a conspiracy of groomers in education sounds absurd, right? And it's just paranoid, and it just, so you end up losing some element of your audience by, out nutsing the other side, which it really seems like, at least in American politics, that's what everybody's doing. Is you start here and one group does something that's a little bit, I don't know if I agree with that. And then the other one goes, yeah, well, you think they're nuts. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do this. You go, okay. And then now I kind of have more sympathy for these guys. And they go, oh yeah, well, look, we're going to do this. It's just like, wow. It's like, okay, this isn't a competition, guys. We can actually dial this back, walk this back a little bit. Maybe we ought to not try to escalate these things into greater and greater stupidity. But I think that's what's happening is, the conservatives will ban books. That doesn't look bad. That doesn't look good. And so then the liberals will say, oh, you're going to ban books. Well, we'll give you a book to really ban now. We'll have, there's one book that made into some schools. It's like cartoon images, but it involves, one person giving another person a blowjob. I think actually they have a strap on, but it made into, it's like, come on. I understand it's high school and these kids do see other things, obviously online and stuff, but still, I'm not sure a public school ought to be put, the optics of that are pretty bad, so it is just amazing, how both sides of our, certainly in the United States, and maybe it's the same in the UK, have really lost their minds. And it's just... Sorry. No, go ahead.
Oh, no, well, I was just going to say, do you, as a psychologist, do you see what's happening? As a psychologist, do you see what's happening in the West at the moment, the culture wars, the hotly contested discussions around race, gender, identity, even the COVID pandemic? It seems like there's so much conflict, so much disagreement. People are falling out with loved ones. There's a real tension around these ideas. As a society, are we collectively having a mental breakdown?
Yes and no. I mean, I don't think that. I just can't say something that is newsworthy, right? I don't have a good lead headline.
No.
Yes, we've all gone nuts. I do everything wrong. This is why I'm not like a best-selling author, right?
No, but the thing is, it's like I'm not looking for you to say. I'm not looking for anything, dramatic. I just want your honest opinion. But certainly something has happened over the last 5 years, and I don't know exactly how you would diagnose it, but there's been a shift in everyone's ability to engage in good faith discourse and think rationally. And I'm just wondering, like, what do you think that is? What has happened?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think what basically is happening is that the incentive structures are changed, and we're giving incentives and rewards to people who engage in bad faith arguments. They become more influential. They get more attention in social media. They get incorporated into, government to a greater degree on both sides than ever was the case, before. Their books sell better, and everything else. So they get incentivized. I mean, the example I can give is, if we were in a meeting of scholars, and even in academia, and I think academia is really one of the core birthplaces of the problems on the left, at least. Now the problems on the right come from other places like talk radio, but on the left, even 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, or maybe six or 7 years ago, if we were in a meeting of faculty and students, whatever, and somebody in the middle of the meeting said, I'm so traumatized, I'm so triggered, and started bawling their eyes out, and we all would have been like uncomfortable, and maybe someone would have patted them on the back and said, well, obviously you're upset, maybe we should take you to another room and you can calm down. But they wouldn't have won the argument, what I mean? And now they do, now they're so brave, and this kind of stuff starts, now the person who's the most upset, who's the most emotional, who's the most irrational wins the argument. I need to start doing this. I need to start breaking down in meetings and talking about how traumatized and triggered I am, and because of my past, blah blah blah. I actually had a pretty good childhood, so I can't really slam that too much. But I don't know, I can find something. I'm part Irish. I can pick up my as a formerly oppressed Irishman. So in our conversation, I'm the oppressed person here.
Well,
right?
mate, you're a white male, and for all I know, you could even have committed the irredeemable sin of being straight. So I mean, you're the least desirable demographic in the West.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Give it a couple decades, and we'll be able to start playing the victim card.
Yeah, so you have to. I am short, however, so I need to start like short studies. Talking about like short oppression. Yeah, no, be creative, right? You can find. Well, I mean, and the reality is that, and I don't want to make light of like gender identity, because I think there are some people like non-binary, for instance, that is true for them. They really, this is how they live. They live their lives as non-binary, and I absolutely respect that. Do I think there are some people that grift on that though? Sure. So I mean, I could come out as a male presenting individual married to a woman, and to say I'm non-binary now, basically claim oppressed status. Maybe I don't know, color my hair or paint my nails or something, but I didn't really change my life, right? And so that's, I think, problem with some of these things is it's easy to grift onto some of these identities, which I actually think takes away from the people for who that situation is really the case. So I know people that identify as non-binary, and I buy it. They live that life. I mean, they present as non-binary, they live as non-binary, and I totally respect that. But if you start to incentivize that being non-binary, being trans, whatever it is not just a diverse group of people to be respected, but in fact, on the left at least, they become courageous, and they begin to win arguments, right? So you can start saying, as a non-binary individual, I believe blah 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 blah. As if what does that matter? I mean, even if you're talking about gender identity, it doesn't mean you have any real insight, any more than anybody else does, right? But you're kind of using identity to sort of like get power and prestige. And I think when we do that, that's a really bad incentive. So identity should not be a status symbol. It should not be something to be oppressed either, right? So we should respect people equally, no matter their identity. But what you end up with now is a sort of sense of, like if you look at like in the United States, there's all these talks about like indigenous cultures in the United States. And of course, historically, the United States, treated indigenous populations very poorly, engaged in brutal warfare, even genocide in some of these situations. No question about that. And we need to sort of understand that. But you end up with a situation where where indigenous cultures are kind of presented as if they were peaceful, matriarchal, everybody holding hands and loving nature and this kind of stuff. And they didn't live like that. I mean, maybe they, of course, there were diverse tribes. So maybe some tribe here or there did live that life, but the average did not. And Native Americans engaged in genocide against each other. They kept slaves, of other tribes, and eventually Black African slaves. And in the case of the Cherokee, they, raped women. They mostly were not matriarchal. They, hunted creatures to extinction. They're just humans. It didn't make them worse than, so history really is about like people, sometimes some culture wins and some culture loses. And now we need to deal with that in the present and try to make things better for everybody. But there is this temptation to sort of twist it into this good versus evil, right? We want like Star Wars for history, where the US is like this big evil empire that sort of like, destroyed these plucky rebels who were on the side of good. And the reality is that both cultures were both good and bad, right? Both cultures had good aspects and bad aspects. One just had, was bigger and had better technology. And that's just kind of how it goes sometimes. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to lift up indigenous cultures, and where they're struggling. And that is certainly the case today. But I think it sort of takes away the defensiveness to history if we sort of acknowledge that, like, look, everybody was kind of shitty, in the past, and we can kind of recognize that. But I think what happens is you sort of give oppression points, to certain cultures, and then what you see happen is then people start to grift on it. So there have been cases in Canada. It seems to be much more of a Canadian thing. I think Canadians are more obsessed about sort of the indigenous stuff than Americans are. It's more African American versus white American here. So we've seen like a number of academics who have pretended to be indigenous. They were white, but they try to present themselves as, well, even one of our presidential candidates, Elizabeth Warren, right, is like 1/6000th, Native American or some absurd, fraction or something like that, and sort of tried to play up her Native American heritage. Why do people do that, right? They do it because there's prestige that comes with these identities. And I think that's sort of a mistake to give prestige to different identities. There should be respect for all identities, but not necessarily prestige. But then I think it creates these incentive structures where it becomes very cynical, right? It's all about gaining power and influence over other individuals. And the easiest way, when you get into the sort of cycle of tribalism, that, one of the easiest ways so I piss everybody off, right? Because I say sometimes I see both sides, right? Everybody, both sides hate both sideserism, right? So I will sometimes say conservatives have some fair points and progressives have some fair points.
How could you? How could
I
you?
know,
How could
exactly.
you say such a thing? You
and
blasphemer!
that
I'm
does
ending this interview now. Who even are you, Chris?
I don't get very many retweets or for those statements.
Well, this interview isn't even going up with a statement like that, mate. I'm absolutely appalled that you could say such a thing.
I mean, look at the whole Elon Musk thing that's going on now. It's like, we're going to destroy Twitter or save it. I don't know what he's going to do. I don't even care. I don't care that much about Twitter, to be honest with you. I don't know why this is a thing, but he can do what he wants with it. He bought it. It's his baby now. But maybe he'll destroy it. I don't know, but it's not my concern, really. So I mean, I think the way you gain influence at this point is by having the most outrageous take, so you'll be considered a hero among all the other ideologues on your side, and most other people is it's kind of like that, what is it, there's no enemy to the left, or there's some sort of slogan like that. Like, even most people who are maybe a little bit wary, like, that might have been a little too far, but they're on the left as well. We're kind of like, all right, better this than Trump, right? Kind of a thing. And same thing on the right. Someone does this outrageous take, and most people are like, well, better that than Biden, so that creates this incentive where these more extreme takes get a lot more attention, and I can say, as someone who pitches op-eds to newspapers, it's kind of hard to, and I've gotten feedback saying, well, you got to pick a side. Can't say both sides have good points.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I stumbled across you because you were part of the 4-person roundtable in Quillette, and you had a clear position when you were writing in that, which is that tribalism is more or less ineradicable. But is that as polarizing as you get?
Yeah. You don't have a lead, right? You don't have this, like boiled down to one sentence kind of thing.
Yeah.
Here's why conservatives suck.
I've changed the title of this YouTube video in my head 10 times already during our conversation. Like, where are we going with this? A fairly diplomatic view on the culture wars people don't click that.
Well, I did say that basically everybody sucks, right? So you can
That's good. I like that. Good old fashioned bit of nihilism. That'll get the clicks.
Cultures suck.
Hilarious. Okay, so as I was saying, let's I think I get the feeling we could sit and talk for hours about the current state of society, but let's try and hone in just for a bit on how madness shaped history, because I'm actually really fascinated by this topic, to think that there was different vital moments in human history where there was a political or spiritual void of some kind, and depending on who stepped into that void and claimed power and influence, the entire history, the entire course of human history was altered. Your book even starts with the line, "Sometimes it only takes one mad hatter to change the course of history," which I like. Do you think mad men and mad women step into that void more often than not, or?
Yeah, well, it's sort of like rolling the dice, right? So you have a pivotal moment in history sometimes, and and I think obviously if you're thinking like the Russia-Ukraine crisis, I mean, obviously Ukraine had one, right? And they were fortunate in the sense that they had, Zelensky, who stepped in into that situation. Now, it may turn out, I mean, I'm usually hesitant to be too praising of any one person in the moment. It may turn out that, he sets fire to kitty cats or hates children, or I don't know, maybe it turned out he's a horrible person in the future. But, at this moment, right, there was this pivotal moment early on in the invasion of Ukraine where it looked to everybody like no way the Ukraine's going to win this, it was sort of the general perception, right? And then at the very moment where Kiev was being initially attacked by the Russians and didn't look so good, Zelensky had that classic line, right? Which I almost wonder how long his speechwriters sat around, and we'd like to think it was this off the cuff kind of thing. I don't know that it was, but it still was a great line where he said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition, right? So he decided not to flee, which he was offered, as my understanding is the United States offered to fly him out, and he declined, right? So there you have an individual who stepped in, and I'm gonna sound like I'm super hagiographic about Zelensky, and again, like I said, he might turn out to be a horrible human being, but at least in this moment, he stepped in and effectively created this sort of like nucleus around which the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian army and stuff could center itself, right? And now they've done with, you know, the help of Western weaponry, of course, but nonetheless, I mean, you know, what are they like? You know, 1/4 the size of Russia, or maybe less. I can't remember exactly the populations, but certainly a much smaller country than Russia, and they're kind of kicking Russia's ass, which is, you know, really amazing to see. You know, of course, we're all like, rah, rah, it's great news as long as there's no nuclear war. But, you know, so we have an individual there that really was this like great person, at least in the moment, stepped in. And you can compare that to Afghanistan, right? Whereas the US pulled out, there's probably a moment there. They had a big army. The Afghans had a big national army for that region, well supplied with American weapons. And what happened there is the president took off, you know, took a briefcase full of money and, you know, and got out. And of course, the national army collapsed, and a relatively small group of insurgents, you know, the Taliban, were able to take over. So it doesn't mean that the Ukraine and Afghan were exactly the same, other than the action of these two individuals, of course. But you can see, like, you know, the bravery of one individual. Zelensky could have died. He still could die, right? You know, and he knows this. He's being targeted specifically by the Russians. I almost said the Soviets, but you know, the Russians. You know, so a specific individual can matter in a particular moment. You know, what happens is you get a roll of the dice, right? So you could end up rolling the dice, and you get someone like, I guess again, we're praising Zelensky maybe more than we should, but, you know, Washington, Lincoln, you know, Alexander the Great, so on and so forth, who's able to seize that weak moment and make something good of it. But oftentimes you end up with a psychopath, right? You know, who you get more of like a figure like Lenin, you know, who after the fall of Tsar Nicholas, you know, it was really unclear. You know, people always kind of think like it was Tsar Nicholas and then Soviets. You know, it wasn't really that easy, you know, and there was a provisional government that was more socialist than communist. So a big deal. But it really was this relatively small group of Bolsheviks, you know, who just, you know, with the power of the personality of Lenin and later Stalin, seized that moment and took over this massive country, most of whom were not enthused about communism in particular. You know, and that's pretty remarkable, you know, as well. So, and then of course they proceeded to destroy any semblance of humanity in that, you know. So, you know, Lenin was a horrible human being, and even to a much greater extent, Stalin was a horrible human being. So the problem with those sort of pivot points in history is you don't know what you're going to get. You may get a figure like Lenin who or Zelensky, who at least we're presuming at this moment is a good faith human being who wants, you know, to establish reasonably humanitarian principles for Ukraine, as opposed to, you know, an autocratic regime with him at the head. But you're maybe likely to get a Lenin who has no inclination of doing anything of that sort, who wants to establish a sort of one-party authoritarian rule with him at the head of it, and is willing to kill anyone who gets in the way. And I think, you know, oftentimes the latter probably happens a bit more often than the former. So that's the risk, you know, of some of those moments. I mean, our good luck in the United States is that at several pivotal points we had good leaders step in. You know, but obviously, as we've seen, we've had bad leaders at other points too, you know, and I would honestly put Trump, you know, in that category. It's just, we're just lucky that it wasn't like 1861 that he became, you know, president. That would have been a disaster, you know, for the United States. So we've been kind of lucky with some of that.
Why is it, do you think, that mentally unstable, mentally unwell people can be so influential and so charismatic at these vital moments in history? Because it almost seems like it's a sort of evolutionary bug that they can develop such passionate followings and influence. It seems like it seems like something's not right about that, and yet that is the case. Why do you think it is?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think for these individuals, they have some deviance to their personality to begin with. So to, you know, be able to think that you have the ability to lead a country of, say, 330 million, as in the case of the United States, right? That you already have to be a little bit weird, you know. That, so if you kind of look at, somebody recently asked me about Putin, for instance, and I said, well, obviously Putin's a narcissist, but that's kind of like shooting monkeys in a barrel. I mean, all politicians are narcissists. You kind of have to have that personality style, whether you're Biden or Trump or Putin or there certainly are differences between these individuals, but the commonality is that they all have these kind of narcissistic personalities. The thing about narcissism is that it can be very charming and it can be very powerful. So one of the best ways to get people to follow you is to have absolute confidence and to shine with that confidence about your own ability to lead, and most of us don't have that. We have self-doubt. We ask people for assurance, and the more we do that, we want feedback, from people. And the more we do that, the less confidence people have in us as a result. So you have people like like I said, I really don't like Trump, and God forbid we end up with him again in 2024. But so just kind of showing my own cards again a little bit in terms of politics. But to his credit, man, that guy doesn't give a shit what anybody thinks about him. You know what I mean? Or I mean, he's got a little bit of fragile ego in terms of like if someone insults him, he has to hit back. But generally speaking, he just does his thing, and he has no real concern for other people in a lot of ways. It's the Trump show, and that degree of absolute certainty in your own rightfulness is intoxicating, to others. People want that because if they're confused, if they feel like they're threatened, if they feel like the world doesn't make sense, most people want someone to come along and tell them, particularly if you tell them what they want to hear, right? That follow me and we'll make America great again, or we'll leave the European Union and things will be great and the economy will boom and we won't have to worry about immigrants or whatever else. So you get to go country by country and find these narratives that appeal to people. It's what we call populism, right? And it can happen on the left just as well as the right. I don't follow UK politics nearly as closely as US, but I think Jeremy Corbyn, I think, was the recent we would call him progressive. I think it's Labour over there. Is that right?
Yeah, Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah. So he's kind of got the same thing. I think So I think there is this sort of tendency in humans to want to follow a powerful leader, and for a lot of folks, particularly for frightened, the more frightened, the more distressed we are, the more likely we are to hand over greater and greater control to a strong person, if you will. And so you have these individuals who are narcissistic that can capitalize on our fear by telling us that all we need to do is give up our autonomy, our rights, our free speech, our due process, and just follow along with whatever this person says, and everything will be okay, right? There are some of us, like myself, who find that incredibly scary to give up that kind of autonomy, right? But most people, again, will kind of do it, to one degree or another. They just get scared, and the more scared people are, the more irrational they'll behave.
What do you think is the average personality profiles of the strong men that step into these positions? So, I mean, for example, I guess another way of framing the question might be, what personality traits did Stalin, Mao, and Hitler have in common?
Yeah. So we talk about in psychology a constellation of personality traits we call the Dark Triad. So it's a combination of narcissism, which we've kind of been talking about. So the sense of, a grandiose sense of your own self-importance. You're better than everybody else. Antisocial, is a psychopath, so you don't have empathy. You don't really care about the impact your behavior has on others. And what's called Machiavellianism. So obviously named after Machiavelli, the author of The Prince, so the idea of being strategic, so being able to look at problems strategically, but unempathically, so it's something we kind of say like, the means justify the ends kind of thing. So that's not quite Machiavellianism, but it kind of is a boiled down version of it, perhaps that, being able to see your way through a problem strategically without really giving a shit about the consequences to other people. Maybe it's kind of a way of thinking of Machiavellianism. So that kind of combination of those three traits work really well if you want to be an authoritarian. It's a really good combination of traits, because you will be a strategic thinker, right? You're not irrational, right? That's what Machiavellianism is, the opposite of irrationality, right? So you're a rational thinker who doesn't care about consequences, moral consequences, and has ultimate confidence in your ability to do it, and so it works really, really well. If you look at Stalin, he was amazingly effective, or Mao. They were amazingly effective individuals. They led countries of, I'm trying to think of what the population of the Soviet Union was in, the early 1950s, but, certainly probably near a couple, 200 million, China heading towards 1 billion by the time Mao was in charge. Massive populations, and they were able to lead these populations mainly through fear, right? But also with some promises, of nationalism and things like that. And it's astounding that one individual could manage to lead these countries very efficiently, even as they were killing tens of millions of their own citizens. That, if you think about that for a minute, like, that's astounding. They slaughtered tens of millions of their own citizens, both of them, in the course of their reigns. And there was not more than a blip in terms of their hold on power, and just the kind of person I wouldn't be able to do that even if I was inclined, right? I get nervous playing video games sometimes.
Don't put yourself down, mate. You could do anything you put your mind to, I'm sure.
Yeah, maybe. But probably not lead the Soviet Union, though. I don't know. But if you like try to like twist your mind around that and grasp like the strength of personality that these individuals had, the ruthlessness of their personalities that these people had, it's just amazing, and you can look at the same thing with Putin, so when people ask me about Putin, is the sense of like, what's up with him. And we actually don't have a lot of background in terms of his early childhood, so the biography is kind of misty for him, but obviously he's narcissistic and paranoid, and this kind of stuff, and he has this grandiose sense of restoring like the Russian Empire and blah blah blah. But the question becomes, is if people ask, well, what if NATO really did escalate? What if like NATO gets involved, not just in terms of like supplying weaponry, but really like boots on the ground, and we follow through with like Biden's claim about regime change, and Putin really does have his back against the wall. NATO has invaded Russia. It looks like his regime is about to fall. Would he escalate to nuclear war? My guess is yeah. Absolutely. Putin doesn't care about humanity. He doesn't care about, the survival of the human species or the planet or anything like that. Putin cares about Putin, and so if he's backed up, and I don't know that the Russian system is so linear that one person has absolute control over the nuclear armory in that sense. But if that were the case, I absolutely think that Putin would annihilate the planet if it came down to a choice between him being in control versus not, which is, kind of scary to me.
Do you because you mentioned how Stalin and Mao were very rational, very Machiavellian. So they had the dark triad of personality traits, as you described it. So were they insane in the strictest sense of the word?
No, they definitely were insane, and I don't want to imply that either of them were without any irrationality, so they were strategic, so you can see even in some of these individuals that they were paranoid. Stalin was certainly paranoid in various ways, and Mao was certainly, had his paranoias and other kinds of issues too, but they were very strategic. They didn't let that get in the way of, moving from one goal to another one. But they're definitely not insane. So insane is a legal term in the United States, where basically a person's mental health problems are so critical that they no longer understand the consequences of their own actions. So usually, like, if you have, paranoid schizophrenia, for instance, and you kill somebody, but you killed them because the voices in their head were saying that they were a diseased Nazi spy who is going to, suck out your soul, or something like that. We say, well, that person is insane, and therefore, they didn't understand that what they were doing was wrong because they thought they were defending themselves, even though they actually committed a homicide, right? Whereas if, that same person with schizophrenia kills another person to steal their wallet, even though they still have schizophrenia. They didn't do it because of the voices in their head, right? They did it because they wanted the money the person had, and they understand that that's robbery, or murder, as the case may be, and would not be found, insane. So insane is very narrow. It's a very narrow construct. Yeah.
So how would you describe them? Like, what's the difference between madness, mental illness, and insanity? Did people like Hitler, Stalin, and Mao have personality disorders, or how would you kind of categorize their psychological frame of mind? Because a lot of people would just immediately assume that kind of madness, mental illness, and insanity is sort of the same thing, but there's subtle differences which are important.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the way I kind of talked about in the book is mental illness is the broadest category. And obviously there's lots of mental illnesses, some of which are no big deal, right? If you have a phobia of spiders or something like that, it sucks, but you're not going to end up becoming the next Nazi leader or something. So, nor have you lost your sense of reality, right? You're overreacting to said spider, but you're not delusional or anything of that sort. And then madness is kind of the intermediary category, which again, as you mentioned, oftentimes involves personality disorders, but it might involve other, complex mental health situations as well. But generally speaking, with madness, the person persists in a behavior that is destructive. Now it might be destructive to themselves or it might be destructive to other people, but they continue in that destructive pattern. So you see that with Mao, with Stalin, with Hitler, they all, engage in very destructive behaviors, continue to engage in very destructive behaviors with relatively little empathy to the damage that they were doing. And they just kept doing it, so they didn't stop, so they just were unconcerned. In some cases,
they had a stubborn streak as well.
They were stubborn. Yeah, they're persistent. They definitely were persistent.
Persistence beats resistance.
Positive quality. And then insanity really is just, you've lost complete touch with, a person who's insane would not be able to lead a country. Now in some of the people in the book I talk about, like George III of England, probably we would say that he had moments of insanity, right? And because it's probably thought that he had porphyria, and that, which is an endocrine disorder, but it causes paranoia and delusions and all kinds of other stuff. So he had moments of real insanity where he was basically on Pluto, if you will. But in his case, it wasn't a personality. His personality was fine, I guess. I mean, no offense, but none of the Georges come across very well through history. But kind of like the rubbish kings of England. But George III was probably the nicest of them. Actually, he was faithful to his wife, and he's a very rigid guy. But he doesn't come across terrible in history. But not like super competent. But his heart was in the right place. But he had these moments that the porphyria would kick in, particularly in the second half of his life. And give him these moments where he just had no idea. I mean, they really did have to, essentially, incarcerate him in one of his own palaces, so that he wasn't in the public eye, because he was, loopy. He just completely out of it, and such. So, but fortunately, the parliamentary system was already kind of in development at the time, so it wasn't a catastrophe for the United Kingdom. Whereas if that happens with in other countries, like in Spain, for instance, with the last king of Spain, they really struggled, because they were sort of stuck with the guy. Yeah, I mean, I think with obviously like Stalin, Hitler, Mao, they're all very complicated, characters. And Hitler's really fascinating because there actually are some medical records on Hitler that are very interesting that we don't always have that with some of these other, characters. But it really is a sense of madness. They're persisting in this behavior despite, it harming, visibly harm. Like there's no question, millions of people have died because of your dumb idea, like I forget what the name for it was. I think it's the Holodomor or something like that in the Ukraine, where they tried to collectivize farming, or Stalin tried to collectivize farming in the Ukraine, and millions of Ukraine, I don't know, like 1/4 the population was wiped out, or something like that in the Ukraine. Same thing in China with the Great Leap Forward and that kind of stuff. I don't know why they always had this idea of collectivizing agriculture, which you think like China could look back at Russia and figure that didn't work with Russia. It shouldn't work with China either, but still went through tens of millions of people, starving them to death, basically, you know, after maybe like, you know, a few years of this, to kind of go, I guess it didn't work. We'll try something else, you know. But you think like it took like tens of millions of people to come to that conclusion that this wasn't working. You know, it's really, you know, a fascinating thing. Hitler is interesting because he still had that dark triad, but he also had a lot of neuroses, you know, on top of it. He had a lot of strange. He was weirdly socially isolated. Despite he was very charismatic, but didn't really have a lot of close contacts. He had, you know, some possible strange sexual hangups. It's not as weird as I think sometimes people, you know, talk about like the one testicle stuff, and I don't think that's ever really been established. But he was addicted to amphetamines and such. So he's a really interesting, very clearly neurotic character, in addition to the sort of dark triad that he shares with Stalin and Mao and some of these other individuals as well. So
I think it can be, I mean, for me personally, especially, it can be kind of difficult to get your head around people like Hitler, Stalin, and Mao committing these mass atrocities as they did, and yet to kind of square that with the knowledge that they were actually acting rationally in their own way. They weren't just completely insane. They were causing these mass atrocities, but they hadn't actually lost touch with reality. Yeah.
Well, I think what we have to do is we have to realize that morality and rationality are two different things, right? So people are sort of thinking like they're acting irrational because their behavior is obviously immoral, right? You know, where in fact their behavior is perfectly rational. It led them to greater and greater power. If you look at like Stalin's terror regime, you know, there probably was in the history of the Soviet Union nobody who terrorized his own people, including his own administrators and underlings, more than Stalin. You know, created this really oppressive, you know, fear regime. But it's how he consolidated power. It worked. You know, that's how he became like, you know, the guy. You know, he got rid of Trotsky. He got rid of all these other, you know, Russians whose names are hard to remember. You know, there were all these Bolsheviks and stuff. You know, and he created these like alliances to get rid of one guy, and then would like kill the people he was in alliance with by forming a new alliance and this kind of stuff. He would have these like you know, heads of the secret, you know, police that, you know, would torture and kidnap and kill those people, and then he would have them arrested, tortured, and killed. And you know, it was just crazy the stuff that he did. Is, you know, morally reprehensible. It's terrible, right? But rational because it worked, you know, and he knew it was working, you know. So that's how he, as one individual, managed to control a country of, again, I don't remember exactly the population in the early 1950s when he died, but, you know, maybe around 200 million people. You know, that's impressive, you know.
Yeah, it really is impressive. That's the thing that's worrying about when you look into these guys, you know, for all of the horror and all of the disgust that you feel when you look into what they did. Like, it's also impressive in the sense that they were even able to do it. It's not impressive that they did it, of course. The moral outcome was anything but impressive. But the fact that they were even capable of doing it, it just kind of blows your mind.
Yeah. It's a trick of keeping everybody else unbalanced, right? So nobody else has a source of power. Nobody else feels like they're secure and challenging that. Again, we kind of bring that back to like the Twitter mobs of today on a much smaller scale. Obviously, none of us are going to get kidnapped and tortured, I hope. But you can see a little bit of that where people feel like, okay, I think something's wrong about what people are saying. It's like the emperor's new clothes, right? This doesn't square rationally with the data as I understand it. But I'm afraid to say anything because I don't know that my dean or my provost is going to back me up if Twitter comes after me, right? You know, I mean, I might be the next dude who's, you know, not literally strung up and tarred and feathered, but, you know, figuratively, perhaps I might lose my job at the very least and shame publicly. You know, if you kind of like take that and see how persuasive that approach is just through Twitter mobs, and then you put that on steroids, you know, and you have the government's doing it, you know, and to itself in some cases, right? And that was Stalin's thing. He would look for whoever was a source of, you know, power, or whoever was a potential rival who was getting popular, you know, and eliminate them, you know. And so, you know, everybody was afraid to be too popular, you know. The only guys that, and I'm gonna screw up their names, you know, the only guys that managed it at all were some of the generals from World War II. I think it was Zukharov. I'm screwing up his name. I know I am. And like Rosakovsky, you know, kind of the really popular generals. But even there, although they survived him, you know, he did manage to make sure they were disempowered after World War II, because Zhukov, I think, and Rosakovsky, but they were popular because they were war heroes, right? And then he managed to make sure they had no control of the military after World War II, but he didn't execute them, so that's the strategy, right? And it takes a really determined mind to be able to, because I have friends, I have allies, even as faculty members, but imagine, like, I don't want to become dean or anything like that, God forbid. But imagine I did. It would take a personality to be able to use these people to propel me into that seat and then destroy them, as soon as I got it, and form new alliances with new people that could pervert, you know what I mean? Like, it takes that kind of, that's the Machiavellianism, right? It takes that kind of personality to be able to do that sort of thing. But it's incredibly effective, because it keeps everybody unbalanced, and it makes it impossible for, you get a person like Khrushchev, who became premier after Stalin, and that dude towed the party line like a toady until Stalin was dead, and then he comes out and says Stalin was terrible, the Stalinization of the Soviet Union, right? So obviously, that system worked to shut people up, and Khrushchev's a perfect example of that.
It's also so interesting to see how the mental instability of one individual can affect the mental stability of the society and the lives of millions of people, not just in that present day, but for generations to come.
It is, and that's why I think, kind of bringing it back to the premise of the book, that it is important that we talk about, like, environmental influences on our societies and technology and stuff like germs. Obviously, we can see COVID had a big impact on us, in the last couple of years. I don't think that, the stuff that happened with race in 2020 probably would have happened without COVID. But I do think we need to recognize the power of these individuals as well, because, as the cliche goes, if we don't learn from history, right, we're sort of doomed to repeat it, and the one thing that was sort of cheering for me beginning in 2016 was to watch how the US system, for the most part, managed to absorb the authoritarian inclinations of an individual, in this case, Trump, and that was a stress test, and I think the US passed it. But how many stress tests can any system pass? If Trump comes back in 2024, I don't know. I mean, any system can only take so much stress, and we may start to look like, a place like Hungary or Turkey, right, where someone is elected into a position of power and then begins dismantling all those things that would stand in his way. And that's really the fear, I think, for, like, the United States or the United Kingdom or really anywhere, is that, if we end up following along with one of these populist leaders who promises a bunch of stuff that sounds good, and I understand why people voted for Trump. That's the other thing. I get it. I mean, nobody has done more to elect Trump than our political left, by making itself as obnoxious as possible. So I get why people, voted for him, even though I think it was a terrible decision. But we do have to remember, like, we have to be able to identify these personalities and say, hey, Biden might have dementia, but I'd pick that over, someone that has this kind of dark triad authoritarian leaning, because that's a much scarier. I think the United States can survive for 8 years with someone asleep at the helm, which I think is kind of what we have right now, but that's another story. I think we can survive that. It worries me more to have someone who's competent, but actually is able to, find the weaknesses in our system and manipulate them to be able to really establish, very firm control. And the reality is, of course, even in a system like the United States, all of our executives since maybe Carter have pushed for greater executive control anyway, whether that's the Bush, Obama, Clinton, Trump, Biden. They've all pushed for centralizing power into the executives, which is a scary thing already. So we're already seeing some stress in the system. And, so it could be scary if we do have someone who's able to sort of come in and really take advantage of where other leaders have already moved us and create a truly, like, Turkey or Hungary like system, for the United States. Hopefully that won't happen. We'll see in 2024. I'm glad Le Pen lost in France. Hopefully, we won't see too many. But as we can see, I mean, she only lost by a relatively small amount. 40% of French people voted for her. Which is sort of startling, considering she's pretty far right. But I think we also have to deal with these situations of why are we seeing strong minorities of people, or in some countries like Hungary, majorities of people who are voting for these authoritarian strong people, and why are they doing that, and what can we do to fix that? So when I talk about the obnoxious left, I think we have to recognize that there are problems on that side as well, and that maybe we're not addressing people's real concerns. If you have a out of work coal miner in Appalachia somewhere, and you're talking about his privilege, for instance, I mean, why would he vote for you? He's going to vote for the guy who's going to tell him he's going to get him his job back, right? Even if it's never going to happen, that's reality.
So we've been hearing a lot about toxic masculinity over the last few years, relentlessly hearing about toxic masculinity. You do sometimes get the impression that that men have this kind of inherent capacity for evil, and we don't seem to have much of the same conversation about women. You said in your book, much of our bloody history can be blamed on men. This sometimes leads to the perception that madness runs in the male line, and that the matriarchal world would avoid the violence, madness, and toxic masculinity of the patriarchal one. Do you think there's any evidence that female world leaders are less brutal than male, or do you think toxic femininity has played much of a role in human history?
Yeah, we actually do have some of that evidence, and I can't remember who the authors were, but there was a study that was done some years ago that did look at sort of like the capacity for war, or the willingness to go to war, comparing female to male leaders, and what you find is that, in fact, if anything, female world leaders initiate more wars than do male world leaders. That's not a diss against women, and I think people point out there's a lot of reasons for that. Maybe it's more of a struggle for women leaders in a politically dominated, male dominated world. That's fair, but in general, it looks like, as I kind of quip to my students sometimes, women don't tend to engage in a lot of physical conflict themselves, but they seem perfectly happy to send off men to die, so there doesn't seem to be any moral repugnance on the part of women leaders to, send, young men to any more than for male leaders, to send young men to die. So we don't really see this. It actually always kind of a weird argument because, in a lot of feminism, and I read a lot of second wave feminism, I've lost kind of track of the more modern stuff, but you'd read a lot of feminist writers who would talk about sort of breaking down gender norms and gender stereotypes and this kind of thing. And that's all well and good. And I kind of support a lot of that. But then when it came around and turned to something that was flattering for women, then they would insist there was this kind of inherent quality of women that was flattering that men could never experience, like nurturingness or cooperativeness, which is probably not true, by the way. But women's groups don't tend to cooperate any more than men's groups. But so you would kind of hear this sense of, if only women, and it would come from feminists, if only women ruled the world, there would be no more wars, which first off is a really gender reductive thing to say for a group that, or a movement that otherwise seemed to be pushing against gender stereotypes. But the empirical evidence we have suggests that is not true. And so if you look at female social units even, and conflict among them, female social units have tremendous conflict. They don't tend to physically attack each other as much, but they certainly do have conflicts with each other, bitter conflicts. And since with a situation like military conflict, you've removed the military leaders aren't going to get in a boxing ring and box each other, right? It's going to be them sending other people to die. And and again, this isn't when I talk about women as a whole, I'm not actually trying to stereotype women or smear women. But it does appear that, women are perfectly happy to send men to engage in physical conflict. So you can actually look at what happens with women in situations like bars, so if they get angry with a guy in a bar, they don't often physically attack the guy themselves. What they do is they go to their boyfriend and cry, purposely. Sometimes you sometimes see these narratives where they say like, I wanted my boyfriend to beat this guy up. And so I went and turned on the tears and, said this guy insulted me and sent my boyfriend after him and that kind of stuff. So yeah, women don't engage in very much physical aggression. That doesn't mean that they're not happy to send the guys out to engage in that physical aggression. They just don't want to, be involved in it themselves. And that, again, to be very clear, that's not to say that like men are more that's not true at all. Obviously, men are perfectly happy to send other men out to die as well. So it's just that there doesn't seem to be that much of a difference between men and women in this particular scenario. The one that also came up, so people like anecdotes, right? So people will tend to like select cases that fit a moral narrative. And another great example of this was during COVID-19. So in COVID, the initial stages of COVID, as it became a global pandemic, people would point to certain countries like New Zealand, and I forget, there were a couple Scandinavian countries. I think Finland was one of them that had female leaders, and say, look, these countries are handling COVID much better than these, like the United States and the United Kingdom, which had male, and Italy, which had male leaders, and were doing pretty badly by comparison, right? In the initial stages, right? And other than the fact that New Zealand's a freaking island, first off, and it can close down their airspace, and that probably had a factor. But so people would pick these anecdotes, they usually be like, they show like 8 people, like 4 were women, 4 were men, and the 4 male countries would be doing terribly, and the 4 female countries would be doing wonderfully. Say, ha ha ha, look, like women are better than men, kind of a thing. It has subsequently been analyzed using actual data, like across countries across the world, and found that in fact, there's relatively little difference between female and male-led countries in terms of like, infection rates and death rates and this kind of thing in terms of COVID-19. And if anything, particularly countries that like force gender equity. So there's, particularly in South Asia, there are some countries where there's quotas, like there are gender quotas on like parliament and things like that. Like, maybe it's not 50%, but maybe like 30, 40% of parliamentarians have to be female. Where we don't have that in the United States, you don't have that in the United Kingdom. That those countries actually had worse outcomes for COVID compared to other countries. So again, it's kind of myth developed about these sort of like female moral superiority, and that's not to say that women are inferior morally either. But it's funny to see, like, again, like it usually comes from the sort of like quasi-feminist sort of perspective of, on one hand, second wave feminists were sort of trying to break down gender stereotypes, but at the same time trying to promote women as more moral than men. We're seeing a little bit of it in the debate between Amber Heard and Johnny Depp right now in the United States, where the psychologist gave testimony and said that they were mutually abusive with each other, and a bunch of people got upset. Well, that's actually exactly what the data says. The data says that domestic violence very often tends to be mutual, and that women engage in domestic violence as often, it may be a little bit more than men. Now, men have greater upper body strength, so there may be differences in injury rates, which is fair to acknowledge. But so yeah, I mean, so there was this kind of like, so toxic masculinity is a rubbish concept anyway. I mean, it's not a scientific concept. It's just one of these culture war concepts that really have no data behind it. And if you even ask people to define it, I actually wrote an article on it, for the Houston Chronicle some years ago, talking about it, that if you look at how people define it, they'll talk about like, oh yeah, men are toxic because look, they watch sports, and they play video games that are war games. And they'll even point to stuff that's like, that doesn't predict anything. First off, in my family, my wife's a sports fan. I don't watch sports at all, but she's a big hockey fan. They kick each other's ass on hockey, so first off, it's not true that only men are, interested in sports. Same thing with video games. Sure, more men play shooter games than women, but there are plenty of women that enjoy those games as well. So, but it is kind of funny that if we don't talk about like toxic femininity, right? And I was talking about this with one of my classes recently, that one of the women who brought up this situation of, well, men are socialized to be bottled up emotionally, and they don't cry, and they don't show their emotion. I said, yeah, but why? Who is socializing them to do that? And if you look at it, it's women who are socializing, because women don't have sex with the guys who cry. Right. It's a sex, we call sex selection, right? The men who portray themselves as stronger, more competent, more masculine, not abusive, not antisocial, but, as more, they do men things, right? They play sports, they exercise, they believe they should take care of their family, they bring in income, they have status, that kind of stuff, healthy-ish male things. They're stoic when it comes to emotional issues. Those are the men women are attracted to. Those men have more sex, basically, than the guys who are snuggled up with a hot chocolate and like cozy pajamas crying at, some romantic movie. Women don't like that. Women say they like it when they're in a college class, but when they actually go out and pick their boyfriends, they don't tend to pick those guys for their
do you
boyfriend.
Do you think we're entering a time where people getting in touch with their emotions, emotional processing, like going to therapy and stuff, can actually aid that more masculine impression, i.e. you can be someone that does all of the things you mentioned but is also in touch with their emotions, and that can be attractive to women as well?
Yeah, but probably not as much as people would like to think that's going to happen. I mean, I think if you look at the sort of mean or median female, they don't really want that. They say that they want it. They want the guy who's got to fix things. They may want a guy who's going to talk some, so they don't want a completely buttoned up guy who doesn't ever talk about. So you can take it too far and say, I'm never going to tell you about what happens at work. I'm never going to share any of my feelings to you. So a certain amount of that can be okay. To sort of build connection, build bonds. But I think if it starts getting to the point of like, I'm so scared, I'm so frightened, I'm, so timid, I need you to protect me kind of thing. No, that's not going to fly for 90% of women. Whereas if you reverse that, right, it's fine. Women can say that the men and men's protectiveness, which again is probably somewhat evolved, will sort of kick in, and men will be protective of their female partners in a way that is, and again, it's not like, as a guy, can you get away with it with your partner every so often? Sure. I mean, I don't think you can't like never do this, but it should be infrequent, right? Like if you're like every day coming home and saying, I want to talk about my insecurities with you, like that's going to become super unattractive super fast.
Yeah.
I think,
yeah. I think there's very specific ways of doing it as well, because I think for a lot of people, crying, expressing emotions, expressing fears, expressing insecurities often comes hand in hand with actually feeling weak, with actually feeling upset, with actually feeling kind of pathetic, really. But I do think there's ways of expressing those things and holding space for those things in yourself and communicating them from a place of strength, which actually can be very useful. And I would even go as far as to say can be attractive, but it really does have to be delivered in a certain way. And I would say in order for it to be delivered in a certain way, it has to be understood and felt in a certain way. And I'd say a very small percentage of people have enough of a hold on their emotions to actually be able to continue to stay strong and upright while expressing fears and insecurities.
Yeah, absolutely. If you kind of look at like concepts like stoicism, right? So stoicism is one of these things that I think gets a bad name. So a lot of these things are like, you want to be somewhere in the middle, right? So for stoicism, the evidence suggests that for the most part, being what I would define as being stoic actually is associated with positive outcomes, which is basically the ability to take your distress, your problems, whatever's going on, and intellectualize it, right? So in other words, you don't become overwhelmed by your emotions. You may have emotions, but you don't become overwhelmed by them, and you're able to still sort of intellectualize, strategize your way through those problems and come to a solution. Now you can go too extreme, and like I said, we can be like all buttoned up and refuse to communicate with your partner, right? And maybe you think you're shielding them from stress, and that's probably going too far. And that's where probably, some women may rightfully complain that their partners are not, maybe they're not sharing. If there's financial problems, right, and you don't tell your spouse that there are financial problems in the family, you're actually withholding information from her that she deserves to know, and she may actually have some good ideas about how to fix those, situations. On the other hand, if you just sort of let yourself become captured by your emotions, right, then that's mental illness. I mean, that's if you go it's far enough. I mean, that's not a good way to exist.
No, I agree.
At all.
I do think though about the Stoic approach in terms of intellectualizing and strategizing. I do think that's very important, but I also think that sometimes that can actually be a bit of a veneer, like a bit of a distraction away from actually feeling the emotions and processing them. I think sometimes a lot of people use intellectualizing their emotions as a way of escaping from them as well, which isn't actually dealing with them. We're getting into the kind of subtleties of it here, of course, but I do think sometimes emotions need to be felt and processed in order to actually be stronger afterwards. And if they're not felt and processed and they're just intellectualized and strategized, then they can often come out sideways in ways in the future that are actually going to kind of force you to confront them in a more maybe negative setting. They manifest themselves in a negative way.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to try to address your question with some hesitance by pulling from Freudian theory. And I say that, so a disclaimer, obviously most of us don't take Freud terribly seriously any longer. His theories were not exactly scientific, so there's a lot of grains of salt with this to some extent. But he kind of talked. I think he had some insights in a few areas that were probably fairly valid. He kind of talked about this idea of defense mechanisms, and I think there's some validity there. I think maybe what you're hinting at is a difference between how he would think of, or how I would think of, as intellectualization versus sort of repression. So repression is kind of when you sort of like take the emotions and shove them down and refuse to acknowledge them. That this really isn't that big of a deal, right? And then, like you said, then it tends to not be very efficient because it bubbles back up and you have problems down the line, right? So you're almost like, denial is a separate defense mechanism, but they're kind of similar in that sense. If you're just trying to like not dealing with the problem. Whereas I think with intellectualization, you're recognizing the problem. You're probably recognizing your emotional response to it, but it's sort of like saying, okay, this thing happened and I feel sad right now. I feel like, we all have these moments, I've had weeks where it seemed like everything just went catastrophically wrong. Right. And at the end of the week, I'm like, my God, nothing ever works out right. And there are two things you can kind of do at that moment is you can kind of wallow in that. And I even something to say, well, something that's tempting. Sometimes you feel yourself, your mood lifting, you almost will try to pull it back. Like, no, things are bad. I need to really sort of like think about how bad things are more. And there really are sort of two things that, one is you can recognize those emotions, but then also use intellectualization to put them into context of saying like, yeah, this week was bad, but the week before actually was pretty good. And next week will probably be pretty good too. This is a temporary blip, and also you can kind of use intellectualization to say, okay, things are bad and I feel sad. I feel bad about it. But what can I do now to sort of bring me out of this and make next, I have these problems now. How can I fix them? Being sad in and of itself isn't going to fix the problem. What strategy can I do to get myself out of this? And
so the reason that I was kind of dwelling on this topic for a minute is because I'll share with you something that I found fascinating. There was some events in my life which I hadn't fully processed, right?
Yeah.
And I intellectually acknowledged them about 10 years ago. And this is slightly different from what we're talking about, but I'd be interested to know your opinion. I intellectually acknowledged these things about 10 years ago, and yet intellectually acknowledging them didn't help me get over them at all.
Yeah.
And I just intellectually acknowledged them, and yet they still continued to kind of, these forces in relationships in life still continued to sort of dominate. Yeah. And it wasn't until literally the last 6 months when I've emotionally processed them by having some pretty high quality therapy and going through a difficult breakup and actually crying some tears for the first time in my adult life that I feel that I've actually shed some layers. Yeah. And I feel like I've actually processed what's happened. And I just find that really fascinating, the difference between intellectually acknowledging and emotionally processing. It's just like a really interesting journey that I've been on, I guess.
Yeah. And what works for one scenario may be different from what works for another one too. Sure. So I mean, of course, there's also the sense of you don't want to have only one tool in your toolbox, for different situations. And I think for things that are like more like deep trauma, whether it's like, childhood origin stuff, abuse, it's not a problem to be fixed exactly, right? It's just something that happened, and you can't really undo it. You may be able to develop strategies to make sure you don't repeat those patterns, and then intellectualization can help for that, perhaps. But I agree that in some cases you do need to really talk through and process this sort of stuff. And again, sometimes you can do that, that might be something you could do with your partner. Although, as you pointed out, oftentimes something like therapy is a good space to do that in, because you really can let all those barriers down. You can cry, whatever else. You don't have to be the masculine, no, I'm supporting you on this.
No, I know. It's just funny. It's just funny, isn't it?
But the trick is, right, is you don't have to impress this person because you're paying them $200 an hour anyway. You already impressed them. So they're not going to judge you. They don't care. So you can kind of, and even if it's, so for a situation like that, I think if you, imagine if you do therapy once a week, that kind of stuff. If you came back to your partner week after week after week, kind of rehashing the same thing in your past, it may get a little bit abrasive over time, whereas with your therapist, you're paying them $200. I mean, it sounds cynical, right? But in some cases, and I'm actually trying to advertise therapy here a little bit. That's what I'm trying to do, to convince people that it can be useful, right? In the sense of you can sometimes talk about things with your therapist that you might be uncomfortable talking about with other people because of your concern about how you'll be perceived by them. You can be freer.
And as you say, sometimes you just need to go over things again and again and again. And with your partner or a close friend, sometimes they don't want to look at this thing from the 1000th different angle. Eventually people just say, look, like, you need to get over it and move on, and maybe sometimes that's pretty good advice. But also, like you say, to have a friend that you can just analyze it, eventually you just get analysis paralysis and give up. But some people need to it takes some people longer to get there, I think. I think some people are quite good at like saying, oh, this shit thing happened. That's rubbish. I'm going to feel upset for a week or two and then move on. And some people, probably people that like overthink or think too much, will go over it in their head again and again and again and again and again. And I don't know what the best advice for those people is, but I, like you say, I certainly think having someone that you, like you say, you paid $200 an hour to.
It's not cynical when I put it that way.
But no, it's really interesting. So something I was thinking about a lot when I was reading your book is how to be born with any mental or physical disability, even at this period in history when we have human rights, tolerance, empathy, compassion, and we value all human life equally, at least in principle. To be born with a physical or mental disability, even now, you're probably going to experience more suffering than the average person. Yet to be born with a physical or mental disability at pretty much every period of human history would have been so much worse, because not only do you experience that suffering, you also get treated very badly as well. So I guess what I'm interested to know is, do you know of any societies that actually treated mentally and physically disabled people with respect? And also how were they kind of treated in terms of medical treatment as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, with some complexities, I'll kind of boil it down and say, I mean, of course, it depended on what mental illness you had, for one thing. But generally speaking, I would say if you were going to be born as a mentally ill person, being born in the 21st century industrialized West or Japan or Taiwan, or you're probably best off as you ever were going to be, in history. And there are some exceptions, if you had certain types of disorders, like, epilepsy used to be considered a deified condition by the Romans. And if you had certain types of psychosis, but you were able to still communicate effectively, something we call delusional disorder, you might become a prophet, right? So there's kind of theory that a lot of like world religious leaders probably had some psychosis, but otherwise were able to communicate just as easily as anybody else, which is not typical for schizophrenia, for instance. But generally speaking, there really are like two main theories that have driven like how therapy works or how treatment of the mentally ill works. And those are the possession theory, that you're possessed by evil spirits or devils or demons or things like that. And then kind of the sort of chemical imbalance theory, so if you kind of look at like pre-modern societies, you see, that most often there was this conceptualization of mental illness, particularly like the psychoses, like schizophrenia, as being sort of a demonic possession, and people were treated accordingly, right? So there would be exorcisms. They would drill holes in their heads to try to help the spirits get out.
When you say that, sorry to interrupt, but can I ask quickly, what exactly would an exorcism have looked like? And when you say drill holes in people's heads, like while they were awake or what? Like,
yes, there was no general anesthesia back then. I might have given you a few shots of whatever they could ferment, but that was pretty much it, probably.
What were they trying to achieve drilling a hole in your head?
So the short version is
sorry, I'm really getting
so the thinking was, of course, a lot of like pre-modern societies thought that sort of like the soul resided in the heart, and that the brain didn't really do anything. So you end up with this like cavity up here, and because it was like the attic, right? And the attic is scary, so like evil spirits would end up in the attic and then like control everything else. But then the evil spirits couldn't get back out again, so you just bang a hole in the skull to give them an exit, sort of thing. It was generally done with certainly nothing like modern anesthesia. Which probably explains why it might have worked, right? Because if you're sort of like schizophrenic and gesticulating and talking to the voices that only you can hear, and someone comes along and holds you down and bangs a hole in your skull, you learn to shut up.
So it would subdue them.
Yeah, subdue them. And of course, it probably created like what we think of now as a prefrontal lobotomy in a lot of these situations. And we know that prefrontal lobotomies do tend to make people more complacent, so they may that might have been considered a success. And some of these people did survive. Not everybody, but some of these people did survive because you could see the bone regrowth over the hole. I mean, people were treated, badly, because the idea was, and it still is an aspect of this, and even the sort of modern versions of like I thought, Christianity and other faiths is the idea that making the body inhospitable would help us get rid of these evil influences, right? Because these evil influences are trying to hang out in the human bodies because it's fun. Well, you just make it not fun and they'll want to leave, right? How do you make it not fun? With torture, right? So, and we still have this idea, right? With Lent, we torture ourselves by not eating the things we like. It's much milder than, banging a hole in someone's head, right? But there still is this idea of pain in many cases, or self-deprecation being kind of holy, right? Cleansing of the spirit. Usually again in more minor ways, although you can see like in Tibet, they do the thing where they drive rods through their skin and hold these big cages up on their bodies with these wires that are stuck through their skin, or in their chest and things like that. So people will still do some stuff that most of us would think is like, oh my God, I'd never do that, just go to hell, rather than do something like that. The second theory, which is more prevalent in today, thankfully, is the sort of chemical imbalance theory, which was actually developed by Hippocrates in about 400 BC. So we kind of think of it as a modern theory, but it's actually quite old. And he talked about the four humors. So the idea of these sort of fluids, existed in a balance with each other. And if we have either a physical illness or a mental illness, then you have to restore that balance one way. Or another, we still talk about, right? If you have a mental illness, it's because you have a chemical imbalance. So it's still more or less we don't talk about the humors anymore. Now we're talking about dopamine, serotonin, or whatever, but the theory is basically, sort of built on the same platform. And then the treatments are generally more humane, but not always, so they still would use leeches and bleedings and heating up glass vials and putting them on people's skin and stuff like that. But the intent was not to torture, just to draw out fluids of one sort or another. And then we just kind of flip back and forth. So then we end up in kind of like this medieval stage, which actually starts in the late Roman era, where people kind of flip back to the possession viewpoint. And so you end up with like the burning of heretics, and a lot of those individuals were people with schizophrenia who, just couldn't cooperate. The average person says, are you in league with the devil? And I say, and if you are, I'm going to burn you with a stake. The average person, well, no, I mean, absolutely not. I'll say whatever you want, to avoid that. But a person who's incoherent, who has schizophrenia, doesn't know what to say. So they end up on the burning pole.
It's so messed up, man. Like, it's actually heartbreaking to even think about, like, just, like, it's heartbreaking to see people that are physically and mentally disabled today, that they're looked after and they have food and a roof over their head, and that's still upsetting to see the quality of life. But mate, imagine back then, the amount of suffering. I mean, of course, most of human history has been suffering for everyone, but it's got a different element to it, doesn't it?
Yeah. And eventually we kind of came back in the Enlightenment back to the sort of the medical imbalance stuff, but then nobody knew what to do about it, so it's one thing to know that something's broken, but it's another thing to know how to fix it, right? So, and people didn't understand how disease worked in general. So people kind of figured, well, if you touch someone with smallpox and you get smallpox, well, maybe if you touch someone with schizophrenia, you get schizophrenia, right? So then they started to segregate them into asylums and, basically in, colonies and this kind of stuff. And that really continued into the 20th century when we had the bright idea of letting everybody out of the asylums. And then the idea was that they would go on these basically psychotropic medications like antipsychotics. And then they would return just to regular life, right? But it turns out the antipsychotics don't work that well. So we got rid of the asylums, which in many cases were abusive, and then didn't replace it with much, and now we have a big homeless problem. A large percentage of the homeless population are chronically mentally ill individuals, who just can't hold down a job. They can't remember to take the medication, because they have schizophrenia. And so we got rid of the asylums. So that saved us a lot of money, but now they're on the streets, so that's not a great outcome either.
Yeah. Well, do you think that we'll look back on our current treatment and with similar disdain? Kind of just we're turning people into zombies. We're not actually, we're not even getting to the root of the problem as much as we're putting a plaster over it, but it's not even really a plaster, is it?
No, I think so. I mean, I think, some degree of psychotropic medication is probably here to stay, but I think that people relied on it. Again, it's kind of like binary thinking. People thought, well, you either have schizophrenia or you don't. If you don't take your meds, you don't have it. If you do take your meds, then you'll be fine, right? And it doesn't work like that. The medications treat some of the symptoms, but not everything, so you still end up with a person who's pretty confused and disoriented, can't hold a job, so on and so forth. And so I think the mistake was, the problem we have with the asylums, of course, is that there was very little due process. So people didn't have legal rights to get back out once they were in. The treatments were in many cases inhumane, very cruel, brutal treatments and stuff. And so the solution became just to get rid of them. And really probably what we should be thinking of is that there probably are some individuals who do probably need long-term state-sponsored care, just that care should be humane and that there should be due process, right? They should be evaluated every 3 months, every 6 months to make sure that they still have the mental illness that got them into the facility, that they're not stuck there when they could actually be returned to society if they're functioning better. That isn't the system we had before, but now what we have is widespread homelessness, which certainly is probably not what we intended, either. So it's a sad situation, but it requires money, right? So then you have to convince taxpayers to fund the stuff.
It is a sad situation. Moving on from that, there was something in your book which was like, I never knew about this, and I find it absolutely fascinating. And I was actually happy to read about it because I've been planning on trying to do a little bit more research into gender dysphoria because I don't really know much about it, other than I obviously know what it is, but I don't know much about what percentage of people it affects. I've never spoke to anyone that experiences it, and I don't know anything about it historically. So I was fascinated to read about the Roman emperor who had gender dysphoria.
Elagabalus was his name. So he was born male and would probably be what we would call today someone who identifies as a trans woman. But the Romans didn't have that sort of language back then, and they were a very masculinized society. So although they were, in some ways they were kind of similar to the modern United States in terms of their approach to sexuality, and in the sense of like they were sexually licentious, I guess you could say, but at the same time prudes. So what they said in public about sex and what they did in their private lives were oftentimes very different. You look at like modern Americans, we're kind of like that too. We love sex, but if you talk about like porn, everybody's like, oh, porn's terrible. Nobody would, you think none of us look at porn, but the reality is, of course, porn wouldn't be economically successful if everybody who said that they hate porn really did it, live their lives that way, right? So the Roman Empire sort of tolerated things like gay relationships, but kind of in a quiet way. It was kind of that like don't ask, don't tell sort of mentality. They didn't do anything about it, but men were expected to marry women at some point. There was no gay marriage, certainly. That would have been unthinkable to the Romans. And there was this general sense that men should occupy men's roles, if you will. So men should behave like men, if they occasionally have sex with other men quietly, and don't advertise it, that's, nobody made too much of a big deal out of it, but men otherwise should act like men, be strong, marry women, be dominant, so on and so forth. And in Elagabalus, he became emperor as a teenager, and he was basically a trans woman, and he took male lovers. He took female lovers as well, but he took male lovers, and which wasn't in itself. I mean, he wasn't by any means the first Roman emperor to take male lovers, but it was said that he basically enjoyed sex by taking on the female, position, if you will, in those relationships. And he was, in some cases, very vocal about. He was trying to find a surgeon who would remove his penis and replace it with a vagina, and that surgery is brutal in the 21st century. You can imagine, unthinkable, but with Roman era,
how
medicine.
would they have even done it? You're telling me about you're telling me about leeches and drilling holes in skulls.
It wasn't a thing. It was not a thing back then. But you can see, like, that's the gender dysphoria. He wanted to replace his penis with a vagina,
and he'd be willing to go through with it, even though
he seemed to be willing to go through with it.
Right. So that's the gender dysphoria. Yeah,
that's the gender dysphoria.
Right,
yeah. And then, so he was, he basically was very feminized, if you will. He took on very feminine roles, very visibly, So again, like, if you were a strong, emperor, and you had quietly had a gay lover, nobody made a big deal out of it. But if you were visibly feminized in the public eye, he was also odd in terms of his religious beliefs. He worshiped this kind of strange sun god thing that wasn't traditional for the Romans, so that was a little bit odd as well. And eventually he became somewhat aggressive in trying to eliminate anybody that was criticizing him or seemed like a rival to him. So he also started murdering people. So it was kind of like a combination. He wasn't very popular because of some of these social aspects of his behavior, and then once he started turning on, in some cases, some of his own relatives and such, then that was the end of it. And it was actually his own grandmother who got him overthrown. So talking about so difficult family relations. Yeah.
It's so insane looking back at human history and just seeing like all of the messed up family relationships.
You think you have a rough family.
His own grandmother. I mean, Jesus.
She had him executed, not just overthrown. I mean, he died. He and his mother were, I forget if they were beaten or stabbed to death, but, basically as the story goes, the last scene of his life is his mother, who loved him to the end, and was this woman's daughter, sort of trying to shield him from the blows from the guards, as it was Roman soldiers, the Roman guard that killed him in the end. It was on the orders of the grandmother, who was a very powerful woman. She was the kingmaker, if you will, at the time in the Roman Empire. And she just kind of realized that her grandson it wasn't working out. It was.
It's so messed up, isn't it?
Yep.
It's absolutely ridiculous. I was reading a book called The Shortest History of England, and it was about just the Game of Thrones with 1,000 years of the kings and the queens and the kings and oh my God. It was absolutely insane that a king would die and he'd have two sons, two heirs to the throne, and they just went missing and his brother takes the throne. It's like, imagine that, your brother dying and the first thing you do is murder his two children. It's unbelievably barbaric, and it was just it was so commonplace. It's hard to get your head around. It's just like, it's ridiculous, really.
Yeah. In the Turks in the Ottoman Empire, when a new sultan, the same thing, a father would die, and they didn't have anything like the sense of, they call primogeniture, which is basically like, passes down to the eldest son. So you had to have like any one of maybe a dozen or more sons, might be the popular one. And if he was able to get enough power to become the next sultan, he would have all of his brothers strangled, so that they were not opposing. That was policy. That wasn't like Richard the second.
I think it was Richard. I think it might be Richard the Third. It was definitely Richard the someone. Yeah.
Who murdered his nephews. That was surreptitious at very least. He tried to make it sound like, I lost them. I don't know what. This was official policy. They just strangled everybody. It was just like everybody knew it.
You'd think sometimes as well, if you're getting all your brothers strangled, sometimes it must have been pretty reluctant. I imagine there was some close relationships among those brothers. I mean, maybe back then you had more distance from your siblings for various reasons. You might have been brought up in different households or whatever.
Yeah.
But I imagine in some instances, you might have been quite fond of these people that you were killing in pursuit of power. And it must have been a bit like, oh God, this kind of sucks.
Yeah. That's about where it seems to have ended, though, isn't
it?
They eventually did get rid of the practice, in the later parts of the empire. But for a while there, even some of the most famous of the Ottoman Turkish sultans, had their brothers strangled. And the downside, of course, of that policy, though, is that once the sultan died early, if he died without an heir, right, he didn't have a brother to turn to at that point, so that created some instability as well. So, but it was designed to prevent the civil wars, that would otherwise break out.
Yeah. Really interesting. All right, 2 final questions, kind of quick fire. Not too quick fire, obviously. I'd like to know your reasons why, but I want to basically know, first of all, who do you think was the least mentally stable world leader in human history? And I know that's a difficult question because I know there's some there's a pretty eclectic list of contenders, but if you had to roll the dice and name one.
It's a good question. It turns, also depends on, do you mean just simply completely out in Pluto or just like diabolical? And so if you're thinking like out on Pluto somewhere, I think like, again, Spain's like Carlos II might be a good contender there, but he was harmless. He would just like a vegetable, but I mean, in terms of like, I think what you're trying to get at, probably like a figure like Caligula probably is hard to beat in terms of just being super destructive, murdering people because it was fun, raping people because it was fun, just bonkers in terms of the things that he would do, just had no strategy whatsoever. Just pissing people off because it was funny. He sent an army to invade England and they managed not to do it because I think their boats didn't work or something stupid like that. So he had them attack the ocean instead, to humiliate them on purpose. He basically wanted to humiliate them by going through. You don't do that as a Roman emperor. You don't humiliate the army. The army is your source of strength as the Roman emperor. So just stupid shit. He had his horse named a senator just to piss off the senators. So sometimes it comes across like,
that's quite funny though, to be honest with you. I think having your horse named a senator, that's the type of eccentricity I can get behind.
Yeah. But people sometimes think, well, he really believed that like his soldiers were attacking Neptune or something like that. No, he knew what they were doing. He did it to humiliate them, not because he really thought that they were going to conquer the ocean. He made them collect seashells and and brag about, these are the spoils of war and stuff like that to humiliate them. He was going to build a temple to himself in the middle of Jerusalem, specifically to piss off the Jews, which he knew were going to riot. Fortunately, he only survived for 4 years as the emperor. And what it seems to have happened, this is kind of, of course, this is very theoretical because we don't have medical records on him from 2,000 years ago. But it seems like he probably got some sort of like encephalitic infection. Like he probably got a brain infection because his first year actually wasn't that bad. He wasn't that bad an emperor. Then he had this major illness, and then he became just like this mad person, afterwards. So it probably was a brain infection that he got, meningitis or encephalitis or something like that. And at that point, the classic example is, people like are performative, right? Virtue signaling. And while he was sick, there were a couple people that said, oh gods, if you allow Caligula to live, I'll kill myself, right? Caligula's on his deathbed at the point. People say this stuff, right? And then, unfortunately for them, Caligula recovered, right? And then he hears about their promises and he says, well, you said you're going to kill yourself. If most of us would be like, all right, yeah, I know you were just kind of like talking out your ass, right? He made them go through with it. Wow. And stuff, and just crazy stuff that he would do. Brutal guy. And of course, eventually, that's one of those situations where he's trying to rule through fear, kind of like Stalin and Mao did. But he just he took it a little too. You can't take that too far. You need some support, so you don't want to, generally speaking, piss off the military, right? So that's what happened. Is eventually the Praetorian Guard, which are the unit that protected the emperor, had enough of him and killed him. and put his uncle Claudius in charge, who ended up being a pretty good emperor, actually. Claudius, he was. They thought he was going to be an easy to control puppet, but he turned out to be pretty good.
Oh, cool.
But Caligula's pretty hard to beat. I mean, of course, Hitler's hard to beat in a different way too. But,
I think you understood what I wanted from that question. I think there's obviously like more diabolical. There's people like Stalin, Hitler, and Mao. But in terms of like actual lack of mental stability, because this guy doesn't even sound like he was rational or tactical. He just sounds like he was just completely off his nut. So basically, my microphone has died and my camera has died because we've been talking for so long. So for now, if you're watching this or listening to it, I am using the image from Zoom and the audio from my laptop. And I think, to be fair, that might be a sign from the universe that my final question is one that no one cares about. Because my final question isn't as juicy as all the conversation we've been having so far. And it certainly wasn't the inspiration for this incredible book. But my final question is, I guess, what do you think the qualities are of a good world leader, and who do you think was the best world leader of all time in regards to sanity, composure, mental stability?
Yeah, those are great questions. And of course we see sometimes that even some of our great leaders like Lincoln had mental health issues. He had pretty severe depression and such. But yeah, I think for a good leader, I mean, you do need to have a certain degree of strength of confidence. I mean, I hate to consider it narcissism exactly. But maybe this kind of benevolent narcissism in a way where you really do believe that you are the best suited to control a situation. But at the same time, you're acting in good faith for the benefit of the majority, that you really do have the interest of the little people, if you will, at heart, even if you
the plebs.
The plebs. Yeah, exactly. Even if you do think that, you are, uniquely assigned, to this role, being a strategic thinker, being able to be not be overwhelmed by emotional responses to things like anger, so you don't lash out stupidly, and impulsively. Not being impulsive, is a good thing. Being able to hear no or you're wrong from advisors is a necessary quality of a good leader. Otherwise, you end up like Putin, who sort of has shielded himself away from a lot of that, and I think it's been a bad thing for him. So I think those are some of the qualities, that are good for an effective, leader, and persistence and resilience. So being able to fail and not give up. So I mean, I think the two that spring to mind, and I'm sure we could come up with a lot of different examples of pretty effective leaders. I think in American history, there's a lot of debate about like who's the best president, and Lincoln oftentimes gets it, and for good reason. He was a really, really good president. But I actually think that Washington, in some ways, had a lot more in terms of what he had to work with, which was virtually nothing, and that he managed to hold a continental army together and defeat, no offense, the British in the end, which was probably the finest military, or at least one of the finest militaries at the time. I
love how you just snuck in that backhanded compliment there.
Yeah. But here's a guy that Washington wasn't a strategic genius militarily, but what he was is an incredibly charismatic and strong leader, incredibly persistent, incredibly resilient, and he was acting in what he believed were the best interest of the citizens of the United States. It doesn't mean he was a perfect human being by any means, but he really was, I think, considering the rubbish that he really had to work with, and the 1776 United States was trash, really. That he created an actual functional nation almost single-handedly out of that is really amazing. And I also get the question sometimes, can you think of a benevolent dictator? That's one I get a lot. And you mentioned him. This is the person I usually say is Marcus Aurelius. It was probably the best dictator in history. Now, if you ask certain groups like the German tribes on the northern frontier, they might disagree with that assessment. But for the most part, he seems to have tried to be a fair, just ruler. He obviously was a very thoughtful individual because he was a philosopher. In addition to being the emperor of Rome, he wasn't a brutal human being for the most part. Again, the Germans would probably disagree with that a little bit, and he seems to really have had the betterment of the average person in mind His big weakness is that he loved his son, right, and that his son was a nut job, and his son Commodus, I believe, became emperor after him, and he was a terrible emperor.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I didn't know that. Oh, because I've got a real soft spot for Marcus Aurelius.
Marcus Aurelius was great. He was great. He was a fantastic leader. His only weakness is that he had difficulty. As we all. I mean, I'm a father too. He just couldn't quite see it in his son. Just what a terrible human being his son was, and his son, and that. So we talk about the reign of the 5 great emperors, right? And Marcus Aurelius is the last of the 5 great emperors, and that's because the next one was not so great, and that was his son, unfortunately. But other than that, absolutely, Marcus Aurelius was a fantastic. If you were going to have a dictator, this is the dictator to have.
Do you think part of the reason that he's got such a good reputation is because, like, usually to become a ruler or a world leader, you require certain personality traits that aren't necessarily going to lend themselves to also being the same type of person that engages in like careful thought and study. The more kind of narcissistic and egotistical you are, the less likely you are to be a philosopher, perhaps.
Right.
Do you think that Marcus Aurelius actually had less of those personality traits that usually contribute to becoming a leader? And is that why he ironically actually was a good leader?
Yeah, I think he actually had the right balance of them, I think. I think he, certainly had the strength of conviction in his own ability, but I think also had a healthy sense of humility in terms of where there were limitations. I think he was also, I keep mentioning the Germans, but I think he had a tendency towards being humane, but also was a realist when that wasn't working. That's exactly what happened with the Germans on the northern frontier of Rome. Is he initially tried to be diplomatic and sort of control them through more humane methods. It didn't work out. So then he basically engaged in something close to a quasi-genocide of some of those tribes. But that was only because the Germans were, not that I should defend that, but it was only because the Germans were recalcitrant and working with them, so he did try, some more positive means of dealing with them before engaging in more violence towards them. But he was resilient, but he was thoughtful. So he did have that sort of sense of, really being aware of and concerned about morality and good living and that kind of stuff, and tried to model that life. I mean, I think he modeled a pretty, virtuous life himself, even as a personal human being, which wasn't always the case even for others of the good emperors, that you can look at like Constantine, for instance, who was, about a century and a half later, that is usually considered one of the best Roman emperors, but he boiled his wife alive, right? So
he boiled his wife alive.
Yeah, well, it's a long story.
yeah, maybe we'll save it for next time, mate. Yeah. Maybe we'll save it for next time.
There's a few precursor events. I don't want to say she had it coming, but it wasn't out of the blue. I'll put it that way. Obviously, it still is a very inhumane.
It's an unpleasant thing to do nonetheless, but there's a spectrum, there's boiling your wife for good reason, boiling your wife for bad reason, middling.
Yeah.
But yeah, mate, do you know what? It has been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. I didn't think when we spoke, when we started this conversation, that we were going to go for 2.5 hours, but I haven't wanted to stop. It's been great. And man, thanks a lot for your time today. I really appreciate it.
It's been a lot of fun. No, I appreciate you having me on.
Do you have any final words of wisdom for the world?
No, just fingers crossed.
Buy my book, man. Buy my book. It's a great book. Everyone should read this book. I really enjoyed it. It's I think, to be honest, that's part of the reason this conversation's gone in so many different directions, because this book, like, it's you cover a lot of ground, and I think that's why it's so fascinating. Kind of hop from different topic to different topic, and then always feed back into the theme of the original book, which was great. It was a brilliant read.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad that you enjoyed it, and
man,
glad I get to share it with your listeners.
Yeah. Well, I hope we get to do this again sometime. I mean, we've gone 2.5 hours. I think legitimately we could probably go 5 if we really wanted to. So if we ever want to get the Guinness World Record for longest podcast of all time, maybe we could give that a whirl at some point.
Sounds good. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Nice one, mate. Well, look, like I say, thanks for joining me, and enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. Take care. You too.
Nice one, mate. Bye-bye.